Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
Miranda was agitated and excited. She had been busy in the kitchen since morning. In the middle of the day, her refrigerator was no longer able to hold the numerous appetizers and salads. On the stove, there was a huge pot of roast from the oven. Came intoxicating aromas of such a pie with berry filling. The woman was still circling between the table and the cupboard, figuring out what else she could create from the food at her disposal. Despite the abundance of dishes, Miranda felt that she had prepared too little food and the guests would go hungry. And the guests were expected to be important. A few days ago, Miranda and Sebastian Jenkins' daughter accepted a marriage proposal from her fiancé David for the city. And today, Jenkins was scheduled to meet David's out-of-town parents, and Miranda was terribly afraid of making a mess of things in front of her new in-laws. She looked thoughtfully into the refrigerator, wondering if she should add some raw slices to the existing slices. When Sebastian's husband entered the kitchen, assessing the situation, he walked over to his wife, put his arm around her and gently pushed her away from the stock of provisions. "Miranda, calm down," he said affectionately. "You've already cooked enough to feed a company of soldiers. The guests won't eat it. They won't even be able to taste it." Do you think the woman was hesitant to go to the refrigerator? "I keep thinking there's something missing. Everything is enough, and even with a surplus," reassured her husband. "You'll see for yourself. Then we'll finish it for 2 more days, as if you're not happy about it." On the business of Miranda's husband, he laughed. "Glad, of course. A kitchen full of goodies. Of course I'm glad. I see you're sweet and sour, and the meat's confused. Why are you trying so hard?" "Me and Kevin are nervous," my wife confessed frankly. "What if we don't like each other? What if something goes wrong? The first impression is the strongest. David's parents won't like some little thing. That's it. And we have to communicate with them later about the wedding, and in general with relatives to be friends. And there's a big age difference between us. Maybe we won't hit it off." Sebastian and Miranda married late after 30, and their daughter was born even closer to 40 years old. Now the daughter was 22 years old, and the parents were approaching 60 years. In the family of the future son-in-law, everything was exactly the opposite. For city elders played a wedding almost immediately after school, and a year later gave birth to a son. They weren't even 40 yet, and their future daughter-in-law's parents could act as their parents at the same time. Miranda, it was very unsettling. "Don't worry prematurely," Sebastian reassured his wife. "Don't you think we don't have many young acquaintances? A lot, and we communicate with all of them somehow. At the very least, apply your professional skills to go for the city. We're fascinated by all native. Extinguishes the oven and let's go. We'll have a little rest. We'll have some tea. Worse? No. For the guests than a tired and withdrawn hostess. They'll be here in 300 hours. That'll give you time to catch your breath and take a shower. And I'll set the table while you're here. Yeah, Lisa will help. Don't worry, we'll make it perfect." "Oh, my heart is racing." Miranda sighed. "And if something goes wrong, Lisa will be upset too." Lisa was the name of the Jenkins daughter, the bride-to-be, which is what all the fuss was about. Actually, Miranda wanted to name her daughter Lisa, and Sebastian was fine with it. But as often happens, the young mother had no time to deal with the paperwork for the baby, and this duty was entrusted to the newly minted father. But here's the trouble. On the day when Sebastian was going to visit the registry office, he was attacked by some insidious virus. In the morning, the man felt only a slight malaise, but in the middle of the day he had a fever, ran a very bad runny nose, covered his throat. Somehow Jenkins waited until work was over. He had asked his bosses to leave early so that he could get to the registry office before closing time. Overcoming weakness, he got to the office, but because of a runny nose, he pronounced his daughter's name inaudibly. At the end of the day, the woman who was working on the birth certificate did not ask him to repeat the name, but wrote it down as she heard it. Sebastian himself was in agony and fever. Neither did he reread the documents issued to him, just took the papers and went to his parents. He reasoned that it was not worth bringing a contagion into a house where a newborn child lived. He was given a week's sick leave. A few days later, when the weakness receded, and Sebastian, taking advantage of his free time, as a decent parent, took copies of the documents to the clinic, to the milk kitchen, to the accounting department of the institute where he and Miranda worked, and to some other organizations that had to be notified of the baby's arrival. This is how Miranda found out that her daughter's name was Robert and not Lisa, only 10 days after the birth certificate was issued. And that document had already been seen by so many organizations that it would have been too much of a hassle to redo it. The woman grumbled at Sebastian, of course, for a long time. But the name of her daughter got used too unexpectedly, quickly. Especially her mother-in-law, having learned about the mishap, said with a laugh. And that she even suits this name. Look how thin and flexible she is. Lisa is Lisa. Jenkins was indeed born skinny and thin. No counter and no tugging. There was no infant resemblance at all. But the flexibility and firmness was there from birth. And that's what my mother-in-law accurately pointed out. Miranda had to put a lot of effort into swaddling the baby. Lisa turned from diapers, described from diapers, and even using the decay of legs, somehow expressed. This is how she grew up slender, thin, flexible, and willful. But despite the girl's unruly character, her mother loved her very much and worried about her daughter. Almost as much as in her childhood. That's why she was worried now before meeting her future relatives. She wanted everything to go off without a hitch. Good, at least with David, future son-in-law Jenkins, were familiar with a long time ago. We cannot worry unnecessarily. Who did the bloodline decide to marry? David was a positive guy in every sense, and Miranda and Sebastian liked him very much. Young people met right after graduation. David and his classmates celebrated the awarding of diplomas in the same restaurant as Robert fellow students. The girl studied at the PhilFac, and David in a technical university at the Faculty of Road Maintenance. Girls and men quickly took notice of each other. They got reacquainted and soon mingled. This evening formed several strong, stable couples, and Robert and David were among them. True, with the wedding they lasted longer than the rest of the fellow students. Robert wanted to find a good and steady job before the wedding. Since childhood, she dreamed of becoming a journalist. But in her time, she did not get enough points in the profile faculty, so she applied for the philological faculty. Starting from the second year, the girl tried herself as a freelance correspondent in different city and regional editions. But quite quickly it became clear that the text was not cramped. She wanted to illustrate her words at least with photos, or better, with video. That's the only way, the girl thought. It is possible to penetrate the modern news consumer, to convey to him what you really want to say. Therefore, having received a diploma, the girl began to storm television. It took her 6 months to get on a local TV channel, and another 6 months to get a foothold there and become in demand. Even a relatively popular correspondent, whose stories viewers waited for, watched with attention, and discussed later both in kitchens and on social networks. All the while, David, immediately after graduation, having got a job in one of the city's construction trusts, courted the rising star of the screen and waited for her consent to the wedding. And then he did. Lisa came running home an hour before the guests arrived. She brought the drinks, helped set the table, shared the abundance and variety of treats. The out-of-towners showed up on time. And half an hour after the start of the feast, Miranda realized that she was worried for nothing. Kelly and John, David's parents, turned out to be very nice people, calm, friendly, cheerful. Kelly was a housewife. She called it still herself. And in between, taking care of the house. John was engaged in entrepreneurship, kept a small manufacturing company, but did not want to talk in detail about his work. Give at least here to rest from business. The man joked back. Make friends with the parents of the future son-in-law managed to quickly enough, and the difference in age did not prevent rapprochement. So Zagorodny Sr. quickly agreed that they will not impose their wedding format on the children. Let the celebration will be held the way the young people want. I think it's the best option, Kelly said. I remember my own wedding with horror. Mom and Dad said since we all pay for everything, we decide who to invite and where to party. And what did we get? A room full of some strange older relatives for the ransom. In the best rustic traditions, music old Toastmaster with silly contests. I wasn't even allowed to choose a dress like I wanted in the registry office. It was some kind of cake. In white rose-colored glasses, I still cannot look at the photos. Yeah, backed up John. It was a tiring event, but it's never too late to get it right. Miranda smiled softly. Now in the registry office, you can order a simple registration. Not real, but solemn and even away. At least in nature, at the beach at home. And have a new wedding just the way you want it. Yes, Sebastian confirmed. We did that for our 25th wedding anniversary. The couple wanted to be romantic. So we did it again. We rented a Miranda dress. They organized a tuxedo for me. And we renewed our vows at the wedding palace. And you know, I was skeptical at first, but at the end of it, I got emotional. I think even more than I did at my real wedding, he laughed. John hummed skeptically, but Kelly was fascinated by the idea, and she began to ask with curiosity and interest how to organize everything, how much the ceremony cost, what are the requirements. Slightly frightened by his wife's enthusiasm, Zagorodny tried to restrain her. Kelly, wait. While we now have a wedding of children is more important. How about we do both ceremonies on the same day? Lisa immediately suggested it. That would be so great, so romantic. And again, the concept. Intergenerational. Continuity within the family. It's like nothing anyone's ever done before. The discussion went to a new level. The women loved the idea. David, as the groom, supported the thread in everything. But the older men quickly got tired of the enthusiastic plans of the group and retired to the balcony for a smoke. Having returned from a smoke break, they began to change plates on the table and finally brought hot food from the kitchen. Only with this they managed to interrupt the conversation and direct it in a new direction. Everything is so delicious, Jean said delightedly. I've never had a roast like this before. Miranda, are you a cook by any chance? No, are you? Laughed the venerable Miranda. I'm an honored pensioner. Cooking is a hobby. I used to work in a completely different field. I'm a psychologist, and not just a psychologist, but a doctor of psychology, emphasized Sebastian. With a meaningful thumbs up. I've never been able to reach such heights. Sebastian and I worked at the same institute, Miranda explained. Only he stopped at the master's thesis and abandoned his doctoral thesis. But I had the patience. Wait, John interrupted the woman. What do you mean? Were there psychologists in the Soviet Union? It seemed to me that they only proliferated in the last 10 to 15 years. The Jenkins looked at each other and laughed. Even Lisa laughed heartily at her future father-in-law's delusions. You're right about something, John. From the media, I said Miranda. Active popularization of psychology in our country really started only in the early noughties, but this science itself is not the first 10 years or even 100 years old. And in the Soviet Union it certainly was. Only in those years there was more demand for social psychology. The course was to work with the team on the compatibility of its participants. There were psychologists at schools, of course, at factories, at large organizations, but their activities were aimed at strengthening the corporate spirit, as they would say nowadays. And for the most part, specialists working in psychoneurological dispensaries were engaged in solving personal problems and detecting diseases, and they were of little value. I'd worked there for a while too. I was interested in interaction with specific people. I went into this profession wanting to help people, but then I saw the attitude to such help and went into science. How did you find out about the profession in the first place if it wasn't on the radar? Kelly asked. Why did it suddenly occur to you to become a psychologist? After all, you can help people in many places. "Oh, that's a very interesting story," David suddenly cut in. "It's not even a story of career guidance, it's a family story." "Tell it, Miranda." Well, the short story was Jenkins, but her future son-in-law interrupted her. "No, don't. Just tell it short, like they told me. So you already know it all by heart." Sebastian mocked the young man. "So what?" David objected. "I like the way Miranda tells it. And the story is interesting. And Mom and Dad will understand everything about you. But now we're intrigued." John said insistently, "Miranda, after such publicity you can't help telling." In fact, John did not want the conversation to return to the discussion of the wedding and the decorative registration of his wife. For the sake of it, he was willing to listen even to a family tale, though he didn't really like such stories. But he liked the wedding ceremony even less, and he didn't want to participate in such a reenactment. John expected that the story would distract his wife from the idea given at the beginning of the evening, and then she would forget about it. So he enthusiastically began to persuade his future relative to tell the story. However, Miranda especially did not resist. After a roast with tea and cake, she began her story. Miranda Kendall. In the future, Jenkins was born in a small village Putilova 200 kilometers from the regional center. She was the youngest child in the family. Her parents had 2 older sons and a daughter. And like all younger children, Miranda grew up spoiled and loved. Although there was nothing to spoil the girl, they lived modestly. Christopher, Miranda's father, worked on the collective farm as a tractor driver. Mother Cindy Larkins worked there as a milkmaid. Simple, quiet, hard-working people. They received an average wage, kept a large farm. And Badja was chewed up at home. However, a simple countryman could be called only Christopher. With Cindy in it, all was a little more interesting. Christopher was a man of the countryside. Miranda's mother had been born on the road and had lived her entire childhood there with her parents and numerous siblings. Miranda Larkin's grandfather was chairman of the Putilov collective farm. Grandmother Clara worked there as a bookkeeper. Daughter Cindy was born to them just after the war. After about a year, grandfather and grandmother tried to give education to all their children. They encouraged them to read books and be interested in various sciences. Good studies at school. This approach paid off. Cindy's 2 older sisters had already graduated from universities in the city and were slowly making their way into the world. The older brothers were excellent in school. They were predicted a bright future. And Cindy herself studied diligently and was regularly praised by teachers. The girl planned to become a doctor, but fate ordered otherwise. When Cindy was 10 years old, her parents were arrested. Her father was accused of embezzlement and misappropriation of collective farm property. Mother was taken with him for company. Reasoned that the chairman of the collective farm could steal state property with the complicity of the bookkeeper. In fact, there was no embezzlement. There were only inconvenient nationality of the father and an anonymous letter that came on him to the district administration. And then the punitive machine spun very quickly. One evening, 3 children of school children, Cindy and her 2 brothers, were left without parents. Where were the adults taken away? Where to look for them? How long will they serve their sentence? Neither the younger children nor their older sisters, who had traveled from the city to arrange custody, were able to find out. Much later, the older sister told Cindy that the alleged embezzlement was just a pretext for arrest. And at the trial, the prosecutors went all out, portraying the parents as enemies of Soviet power, Zionists, terrorists, and God knows who else, simply because of their nationality. As a child, from the conversations of her elders, Cindy realized that everything was the fault of her parents' positions. Everything is the fault of her parents' positions in a small collective farm. The chairman of the accountant is practically the upper class, the elite. There is always someone who is jealous and wants to live in the light. So, to live a quiet life, you have to keep your head down. So reasoned the 10-year-old girl, especially if you come from a Jewish family. And if your parents were arrested and taken to the camps, it's better to live modestly, but quietly and peacefully, than to make your way into the world, risking your life. No, Cindy didn't drop out. She graduated from high school with honors and even turned from Cindy to Cindy Larkins. But she did not stop reading books and interested in science and medicine, in particular, subscribing to various general education magazines, watching educational programs on television when it appeared in the house. She was a woman, intelligent, erudite, finely sensitive with excellent artistic taste, but having finished 10 years of school, did not go to the city to enter the institute, and got a job in her native collective farm on the simplest and most inconspicuous job. So she spent her whole life in it, refusing even to be promoted to foreman of milkmaids. It seemed to her that even such an insignificant career advancement would bring danger to her and her family. Cindy's older brothers and sisters left for cities and towns. The girl stayed in her native village. For a while she lived in her parents' house. But soon after graduation, Cindy married Christopher Kendall and moved into a hut, which was allocated to him by the collective farm. The girl for a long time rejected the advances of the visiting guy. It even came to the point that she hid from him in the backyard. But Christopher was persistent and continued to pursue Cindy persistently and methodically. In the end, Cindy summoned him for a conversation and told him about her biography, about her arrested parents. Should you ruin your life by associating with the daughter of an enemy of the people? She asked, having finished the story. So it is necessary. Angrily, replied Christopher. We have a son is not responsible for the father. I forgot. And a daughter is not responsible for her father either. And knowing where these enemies of the people come from. A month later they got married, and a few years later the young built their own house and moved there with their first child. And the house of their beloved parents was empty and decrepit by the time of the birth of their youngest daughter, Miranda. From it remained almost one hulk towering among the weeds and frightening the children, the failing windows. Cindy sometimes took her daughter there. The two of them would walk around the property, jumping on the floor balcony inside the ruins. And Cindy Larkins would tell how things used to be here, and Miranda would listen and memorize. The girl got into the habit of visiting the old house once a week, of spending some time in it talking about the weathered walls, about her life. It seemed to her that her grandparents were invisibly present among these ruins, listening to her and delighted granddaughters' stories. Miranda decided to visit the abandoned house twice a week and strictly adhered to the schedule. Only in winter did she sometimes miss visits in the worst of the frost. The year the girl turned 10, the winter was warm and snowy. One January day, the girl sat in the ruins until almost dusk, telling at home how she and her relatives celebrated the new year. She caught up only when a snowstorm started outside. Miranda, she realized, had to get out, or the path to the street was barely trampled. She'd notice in no time. Heavily, shuffling her feet through the snow, the girl got out on the shriveled porch of the house and saw that a man was sitting on the Leningrad. Looking closer, she realized that the alien had been here for a long time. Small drifts of snow had managed to gather on his shoulders and top. Miranda was wary, but she realized she had nowhere to go. She would have to leave the lot anyway. She couldn't just sit around. She moved forward with determination, reasoned that if a man tried to attack her, she'd raise a ruckus. A dozen meters from the family ruins stood an apartment building across the street, another. Would anyone hear her screams? Barely past the lot. The path was already partially snowed over. The girl equaled the fence and found herself a couple steps away from the stranger. Looking closer, Miranda realized that on the remnants of the fence sat a woman, almost an old woman. She was dressed in some inconceivable rags. Her head was covered with a scarf. The old woman's face was unfamiliar, and it was puzzling. The village, though it had grown in recent years, but it was still small. All the inhabitants knew each other in one way or another, but this woman Miranda had never seen. She could have sworn it. The old woman sat motionless and paid no attention to the girl, didn't even turn her head in her direction. She did not seem to see Miranda. The girl began to look at the stranger and suddenly saw that tears were flowing down the alien's cheeks. "Grandmother, why are you crying?" loudly asked Miranda. The old woman did not answer, and it seemed she did not even hear that she was being addressed. The girl repeated the question and then began to shake the old woman by the shoulders. "You're all right. What's wrong? Why are you sitting here?" inquired she. "You're freezing. We should go home. Would you like me to walk you home?" Miranda's efforts were successful. The stranger finally snapped out of her trance and saw the girl. Hearing what she was being told, the old woman only sighed and shook her head. "There's no place for me to go, sweetheart," she said hoarsely, as if in a chicken voice. "I have no home." "But where did you come from?" Miranda wondered. "From afar, sweetheart," said the old woman, still monotonous, like a broken record. "I'll never make it back." How could it be? The girl was seriously upset. For some reason, a strange woman had caught her eye. "You can't just sit here, can you? It'll be night soon. The blizzard's coming. You're freezing to death." The old woman just nodded her head. The prospect of freezing to death didn't seem to bother her at all. "Come with me," Miranda said decisively. "Come and visit us. My parents are good, don't be afraid. And the house is big enough for you to sleep here." And then decide what to do next, she demandingly pulled the stranger by the arm. "Come on, let's go, or he'll notice the road. We'll never make it. My goodness, you've turned into a snowdrift." The girl managed to push the old woman out of the way, rising heavily from the debris of the fence. The stranger followed her. Miranda held the old woman's hand tightly, afraid that she would suddenly change her mind or simply get lost in the snow swirls. They reached the house after dark. Cindy Larkins was peering out the window and, seeing her daughter, jumped out on the porch. "Where they carry you grumpily," she grumbled. "I kept my eyes peering. It's nighttime. The storm is raging. And you are schlepped somewhere." The woman noticed the guest, which her daughter persistently pulled behind her all, and remained silent, then hesitantly spoke. "Hello, Mom. It's Grandma who's lost," Miranda explained. "I brought her to us. She says she doesn't know where her home is or where to go. Let her wait here tonight. We can't let her go out in this weather. We can't." The mother agreed and turned to the old woman and invited her to come in, please. "Here, develop here. You can hang your coat here." Cindy Larkins helped the alien to undress. Under the coat turned out to be worn another one, and under it a glass fungus sole of strange color. It seemed never to have been cleaned once in its life when all the outer clothes were hoisted on a hanger. The old woman appeared skinny, if not skinny. The shawl from her head, she was reeling, and Cindy Larkins had evidently taken to fiddling, fitting both his topcoat and Valenki. By the stove, Mama was pestering Miranda. It was Granny who said she came from far away. "So she's not from our village. I don't know her. See if you recognize her. Maybe she's a local after all. They say old people sometimes forget where they live." "It happens," the woman responded. She took the old woman to the corner between the stove and the table, the warmest place in the kitchen, seated her on a chair covered with a soft thread, leaned over the guest, looked into her face, and suddenly froze, scrutinizing his features. For several minutes, the two women, old and young, gazing at each other. Miranda became subdued, but looked at them both. She was surprised to hear her mother suddenly ask the old woman in a stern voice, "Laura?" The alien nodded in response and, in turn, asked the landlady Cindy a question. "Cindy Larkins is now Kendall," mumbled the woman and cried. Hugging her guest tightly and resting her nose on the top of her head, the old woman picked up Cindy Larkins, but with both hands she pushed her nose into her chest and, from the sounds of it, cried too. Miranda watched the scene with all her eyes. I think she even forgot to blink. The door slammed behind her. Christopher's father entered the house. After assessing the situation, he loudly asked Cindy what was going on. Yes, Cindy, the sane woman, raised her face at her husband, flooded with tears. To Miranda's surprise, it was completely happy. "Meet Christopher," she said. "This is your mother-in-law, Clara. Sarah is my mother." Hugs she did not ponder. And the old woman, though she turned to her son-in-law, continued to hold on to her daughter with both hands. Christopher was quick to recognize the situation. "Pleased to meet you," he said politely to the guest. "So why are you standing there? Let's get the table ready. Grandma, you go, we need to feed. See, mother is busy. Let's manage." He shook the girl by the shoulder, and only then Miranda was able to shake off her surprised stupor and began to organize in the kitchen. Slar was released from the colony 2 years ago due to the end of his sentence. None of her relatives knew about it, and there was no one to inform her of the release. During the first year of her imprisonment, Slaga strictly forbade her older children to write to her. She was afraid that such correspondence could affect their reputation in a bad way and hinder their future life. After that, she stopped replying to the letters of her daughters and sons, and later she was transferred several times from one camp to another, from place to place. And when her youngest daughter, Cindy, grew old enough to have the right to search for her mother, it was impossible to find her. Cindy sent inquiries to various authorities for several years, but it seems that the bureaucrats and the penal system themselves were confused by the paperwork and were unable to give the young woman a clear answer. I did not know my children's 3 new addresses, and my own old home address, during the time in captivity, have forgotten. She only remembered the name of the village where she had once lived with her husband. That's where she decided to go. The camp authorities issued a certificate of release and some road from the colony to the village, past which the railroad passed. The woman hitched a ride. It was not far to go, about 20 kilometers away. At the station, she spent a long time finding out from the cashier how to get to the village, or rather to the center of the region in which the village was located. She and the cashier figured out the route. But here's the trouble. There were no tickets for passing trains. They said to wait. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe next week. She had nothing to do, so she decided to walk around the village near the station. The village was small, not very well maintained. There were no sights or amenities, but the woman didn't care. She was delighted by the very possibility of walking anywhere, without having to answer to anyone and without fear of breaking any rules. She wandered through the streets and alleys, looking at houses and yards, rubbing the backs of stray dogs. Sit down to rest on benches by the fences. It was September. Trees in golden foliage looked incredibly beautiful. The weather was warm and the air was fresh. Clara lost track of time, and when she found herself on the outskirts of the village, she was surprised to notice that it was beginning to get dark. The old woman moved back towards the station, hoping to spend the night at the tiny station. But at that moment, someone hit her hard on the back of the head. Clara fell to the ground and lost consciousness. She woke up in complete darkness and found herself lying in the storm. I tried to get up, but the back of my head hurt treacherously. My head was spinning. My throat was receding, nausea sticking from the fence. The woman sank back down into the thicket, examined herself under the giving grasses, arms, legs intact. Her head was not pierced. No blood, but thickets all around. The knot of Kaz is not rich yet. Not there either. I'm angry. What kind of robber went for old rags and a loaf of bread? Nearly took his life. Who do you think you're robbing? You can tell from a mile away that she's an ex-convict. They see them regularly in the village. They've learned to recognize them by now. But then Clara noticed that she wasn't wearing a trench coat and groped her body and clothes. The woman realized not only her poor belongings were stolen, the certificate of release and the little money she had were gone too. And that was a problem. She couldn't leave without her papers. The only way to legally buy a ticket from here was to show her ID. She couldn't get a passport either. And she was supposed to register with the police within a certain period of time, get a residence permit, and settle some bureaucratic formalities. If she doesn't do that, she'll go back to jail. Shit, I don't want to do that. Even the loss of money didn't bother him as much as the loss of the certificate. But what to do? Where to go? With a complaint of robbery, the woman could not understand. In fact, she couldn't even run. When she tried to stand upright, she began to feel dizzy. Consciousness threatened to leave her long-suffering head. Little by little, her eyes became accustomed to the darkness, and Clara could see a small barn nearby behind a low fence. The woman crawled toward it, climbing over the fence, which, fortunately, was no higher than her knee, climbed inside and entrenched herself in Navalny in the construction of the hayloft. "I'll give it up for a while," she thought, "and then I'll decide how to be, not to lie under the fence." With this thought, Revue fell asleep. She was awakened by the owner of the barn, who noticed the intrusion into his territory. He was a sturdy old man. He swore at first, but not in a mean way. "What are you doing with that fence?" "My flower has fallen." He got angry. "You could have knocked on the house, asked to spend the night like a human being. Wouldn't he have let you in? We are all human beings. We all treat your brother with understanding." However, having heard about the alarm about what had happened, the muzhik stopped grumbling. He brought his suddenly and guests water and a crust of bread, and himself disappeared, to return soon with a policeman and a local paramedic. The police representative questioned Riva in detail about what had happened to her during the night. He examined the territory, asked for written explanations from the old woman and from the owner of the plot. The paramedic examined the old woman and diagnosed her with a concussion. At least a couple weeks of bed rest was recommended. The man, who introduced himself as Stephen, carried her into the house, arranged her on a shell bed in the kitchen, told her to rest and gain strength. "Anyway, until your documents are resolved, you will not be able to go anywhere," he explained. Stephen said that Clara was not the first in their village to be attacked. For a year now, there have been some kind of seagulls in the neighborhood, hunting for ex-convicts. To recognize them among the locals was simple criminals Bodaroatel, or people who came out of the camp and poked them intimidated, and sometimes just attacked from the back and publicized, as it happened with Lika, and then robbed afterward. Why? The old woman was perplexed. What good would they do to us? There's nothing to take from us. No property, not even pennies on the road. "Oh, you silly Clara," Stephen lamented. "And the documents are a certificate of release. That's their main prey. And that's what they're after. And what do they do with certificates? Do they get free train tickets?" I continued to wonder. "Do they need those tickets?" Waved Stephen away. "You understand that the most important thing in the certificate is that you can get a real passport with it. No check will not dig up. And with this passport you can do so much with it, or sell it for good money. And these crooks know exactly who needs such a document. They correct the certificates in Ashen as they need them. They change the year of birth, change the photo, glue it to these papers at the passport office. They look very closely, especially if the passport office is far from the camp. So they go far away. And then they use the stolen documents to get passports. That's what our district officer told me," he explained. "These bastards have been hanging around here for a long time, but they can't catch them. They're running all over the neighborhood. And with their traveling, it's all over the country." The effects of the concussion took a long time to wear off. Her weakness became her constant companion. She stayed at Stephen's for over a month. During this time, in the local militia, you gave the woman a new certificate, and she received a passport here in the village. You had to go to the permanent place of residence to get the documents. There was no time to go there. The legal deadline was coming to an end. Stephen persuaded the old woman to winter at his place. The man lived alone. His parents had died long ago. He had no wife and children. His brothers and sisters were partly scattered across the country and partly taken away by the war. He was glad to be alive. He was glad to have a soul in the house. He reasoned that it was worth to gain strength and recover before a long trip. Besides, the winter promised cold, and there were no warm clothes. Until the end of May, she lived in the house of her savior, kept house, cooked food. She worked part-time as a cleaner in the village Novi Club, in order to save at least a little money for the road to her native village. When summer came, she got ready to go. She felt better, noticeably stronger. She felt less dizzy. And what about the occasional memory lapse? She tried to ignore that. She said goodbye warmly to Stephen. The man had packed her a substantial bag of provisions for the journey and wanted to give her some money, but she decided that her own savings would suffice. The journey was supposed to take a couple of weeks, but somehow it took almost a year and a half. How come? Leek didn't finish listening. Fell asleep exhausted by the events of the evening. Already later she mentioned that at some point she forgot where she was going, and when she came to her senses, she found herself at an unfamiliar station with no provisions and almost no money. She traveled part of the way on foot. Sometimes she caught a hitchhiker, rode as a hare between the train cars, asked for alms, asked for lodging in villages, slept at the stations, on benches, wherever she had to. And when after all the ordeals she finally reached Putilov and saw her native house in ruins, she almost lost her mind. It became clear that the long journey had been made in vain. There were no relatives. There was nowhere to bow one's head. Of course, one could walk through the village, look for people who remembered her, stay with them. But the old woman was afraid. She still didn't know which of the villagers had written that unfortunate anonymous letter about her and Larkins. But just in case, she trusted no one else. From fatigue and confusion, the old woman fell into a kind of mental trance. In this state, she sat on the cook fence of her former home for over an hour. She would surely have frozen there if Miranda hadn't noticed her. Destiny. The adults alone spoke with significance. It's all mysterious. Others echoed them. I thought nothing was fate. There was no mysticism and mystery in her meeting with her grandmother. It's just that for so many years she'd been calling her home. With her constant stories, with her presence in her house, Grandma just couldn't help but hear. So it's all right. The Kendalls had set up Slaga in a passageway room. The rest of the rooms in the house were occupied. Daughter and son-in-law fixed up the old lady. Did the department grant her a pension? By spring, Clara recovered from her long journey and joined the life of the family. Cindy Larkins clearly thanked all the gods in the world every day for bringing her mother back. Miranda adored her grandmother, even though she was not a sugary character. The old lady was her own free-spirited, risk-taking self, but her relatives forgave her for it. Everyone realized that if she had been God's dandelion, she simply would not have survived either in the camp or after it. Cindy wrote to her sisters and brothers about her mother's return, and all summer long the Kendall family had a pilgrimage of guests, of joyful guests. Was that summer happy, filled with the brightest emotions? But with the onset of fall, a serious problem arose in the house. She began to scream in her sleep, talking loudly with interlocutors unknown to anyone. "Give me my bread, or all the assholes are pulling," she shrieked in the middle of the night. "The certificate. My certificate. Where is it? They'll put me back in camp without it. I don't want to." The scream woke up the family. The next night, everything hurts inside. The old woman read in the night, without thinking, "The eye of the bishop. Why such a punishment? It's like I'm being torn to pieces," she called at the top of her voice. "Fooled him. Where are you dragging him? You bastards." These cries woke up the whole house. At first, they were repeated about once a week, but by midwinter, Clara was getting the whole family out of bed every day. She herself remembered nothing of the bad dreams or her screams, but would only shut up when her daughter or grandchildren pulled her out of her sleep. The old woman was embarrassed by the trouble she caused her loved ones, but she couldn't help herself. Sleeping pills and sedatives that the village paramedic offered did not help. After them, on the contrary, it became more difficult to wake up the old woman during her nightmares. She should be treated in a psychoneurological dispensary, thoughtfully said the local medic Cindy. At these words exploded. "Do you want me to send my own mother to a mental institution? That's the last thing we need." But nevertheless, Kendall's life was becoming increasingly difficult. The family stopped getting enough sleep. Grandma's seizures could recur several times a night, and there was no rest in between. Christopher and Cindy became irritable. They often complained of fatigue. No wonder, because after restless nights they had to go to work. Yes, it's not easy shifting papers in a warm office. And doing physical labor. Miranda and her older brother also felt the impact of not having enough to eat, although it was a little easier for them as children than for adults. It went on like this until the spring. By May, Cindy Larkins was ready, if not to accept the paramedic's suggestion that the old woman be treated in a mental hospital, then at least to discuss it further. She and her husband were completely exhausted and didn't know what to do. Miranda, hearing the conversation of the elders, realized that the grandmother would not approve of the treatment. Moreover, she would be angry at her daughter for such a decision. And then Miranda would be angry with her. The girl suggested to her mother to move the old woman to her room. She lived in the farthest corner of the house from her parents' bedroom and hoped that from there she would not hear her scream so much. "She'll give you no peace at all," Cindy Larkins lamented. "So what?" Miranda waved it off. "It's summer. I don't have to get up for school during the day. At least you and Daddy will have a rest." Was the girl so convincing, Mother? Too exhausted. But soon the old woman's relocation took place. The first few nights the girl swore, jumping out of bed, hearing another scream. However, after a few days she thought that it was possible to try to cope with the grandmother after a nightmare sleep and forced booth. The old lady fell asleep for a long time. Noise contrived, complaining about the fact that it disturbs her granddaughter. It's exhausting even more than her shouting. And Miranda decided to come up with a way to soothe her without waking her from sleep. At first, the girl simply approached her grandmother, barely hearing her voice, stroked her head, and on her hands quietly and affectionately coaxed her. "It's a dream, Grandma," she repeated patiently. "It's not real. It's all right. You are at home. No one is hurting you. Mommy and Daddy are there for you. They'll protect you." But the old woman just didn't hear her granddaughter. And then Miranda devised another plan. The next night in the next bed, there were cries. "That's my bread, give it back, to whom I say, you shameful thief." Miranda sneaked up on her grandmother and spoke persuasively. "Here's your bread, girl. Nobody's taking it away from you. I took it to salt you with salt, it tastes better. Here." The girl repeated it several times, and suddenly Clara heard her. "It tastes better with salt," she agreed. "Thank you. Forgive me, I was scared." The old woman turned sideways and fell asleep peacefully. Miranda froze enthusiastically at her bedside. Had it really worked? The rest of the night passed surprisingly quietly. In the morning, the lyricist rose awake before noon. She wanted to tell her grandmother about the night's events, but with some sixth sense she realized that it was not worth it. Instead, she asked her grandmother, "You sometimes yell about bread at night. Did someone really take it away from you?" "True," the old woman replied reluctantly. "I had just been brought to the first camp in Barak, and there was a woman who tried to take my rations. I attacked her. Where did the anger come from? I don't know." My grandmother was silent, and then she added, "But you know, I remember now that she gave me back my piece. She said she wanted to salt it." Miranda nodded her head. She didn't know how the story of the stolen harmonica really ended, but she suspected that the outcome was not as peaceful as her grandmother saw it today. She remembered the phrase about salt from a dream in which her granddaughter had intervened. The girl decided to continue her experiments, but not only to appease her grandmother, but also out of research interest. The next night, barely beyond the dream, she began to wail pitifully. "Everything hurts, like it's tearing me to pieces from the inside." Miranda immediately crept over to her bedside and spoke closer. "Get some rest. Here is the most modern medicine for you. You take it. Everything will go away. Everything will stop hurting. Good for you." As if letting go, muttered the grandmother a moment after the girl's words. "Of course," confirmed Miranda. "The pain will go away now. You sleep. You'll wake up and forget everything." Soon the old woman stopped moaning. She sang and even curled up under the blanket. Miranda realized that the nightmare had receded. Once again, the grandmother slept peacefully until morning. But the next day, her granddaughter did not ask her about the nightmare. Determined not to awaken her memories, Miranda took the experiment seriously. She kept a notebook in which she noted how often she talked to Clara in her sleep, how quickly she calmed down, whether the attack was repeated, and soon noticed from her notes that the nightmares in which she managed to wedge in repeated less and less often, and after a few months and disappeared altogether. This encouraged the young explorer even more. In her for a flicker of hope that it will be possible to completely cure her grandmother of night attacks. And soon this hope was confirmed. Nightmares began to visit her less and less often. Sometimes Miranda slept through the night without her screams. Sometimes you only had to get up to her once a night. But there was no more like the beginning of last fall, when Slaga read every 2 o'clock. Miranda considered it her small victory. Not always the girl managed to calm the old woman with the first time to pick up the words. For example, when Clara started calling for her husband and screaming to let him go, she usually had to be woken up. "Miranda, I tried telling her your husband wasn't taking him anywhere." But the old woman didn't believe it. She'd spent too many years without her husband. She remembered the separation too well. The phrase, "We'll figure it all out and bring your husband back." No one of Slava's age would have believed such a statement from the law enforcement officers. Miranda went through the phrases. I wrote down the unsuccessful ones. Finally, she guessed to address her grandmother as if on behalf of her grandfather and promise her that he would surely survive, and they would meet again. Soon after this discovery, Clara's most agonizing nightmare gradually let her go. Before the start of the school year, Cindy Larkin suggested that her daughter move her grandmother from her bedroom back into the pass-through room, but Miranda refused. She reported to her mother that Clara had become a much more restful sleeper. Cindy had noted this herself, although her daughter's room was away from the bedroom. At first, she often heard the usual night noises from there, but by the end of the summer, such episodes became fewer and fewer. After rejection, she was glad several times to the door of her room at night, hearing her mother's voice and eavesdropping on what was going on. Finding out what was going on, Cindy Larkins pondered the situation and went to hold a consultation with the local paramedic. He approved of Miranda's methodology. The doctor talked to the girl, read her diary of observations of her grandmother, asked about the results, and afterwards he praised Miranda fervently, saying that if she continued her experiment, she would be able to cure her grandmother completely. He explained for a long time how and why the method invented by Miranda works. He said some wise words the girl did not understand even half of it. But she did. She's on the right track. A year later, a peaceful sleep returned to Kendall's house. She stopped screaming at night. And if she had a nightmare, the family knew how to calm her down quickly. They didn't tell the grandmother herself. They just tried to treat her as kindly as possible. Miranda could be proud of herself, but she had no time for that. She judged the paramedic for a while to explain to her how things had turned out in simple words. To the medic's credit, he did not dismiss the curious girl and managed to lay out his assumptions for her. In addition, he recommended several popular scientific publications from which you can understand how the human psyche works. The subject fascinated Miranda, and she plunged headlong into the study of psychology. First on the basics, and then more seriously. By the end of school, the girl already knew exactly what she wanted to devote her life to and did not retreat from her decision. All this long story Miranda told the parents of her future son-in-law. Of course, it was much shorter. Although David constantly intervened in the narration, clarified the details, drew the listener's attention to the details. He himself had heard this story not for the first time and liked it very much. He admired the ingenuity of little Miranda, the selflessness with which she took to help her grandmother, the patience and warmth of heart she showed during her impromptu healing session. "I would never have thought of this at 11 years old," the young man exclaimed. Among other things, David was struck by the very history of the Kendall family. Born in the mid-90s, he had not seen the Soviet Union, and about repressions, camps, persecutions on ethnic grounds. He knew the KGB and NKVD only through excerpts from old movies and history books. It was strange for the young boy to encounter people who had actually seen and experienced all this. He was especially surprised that these people were not stale old men, but quite cheerful and adequate people. His future father-in-law and mother-in-law, Kelly and John. Miranda's story impressed him too. After it, they had a long conversation about the vicissitudes of fate, about how childhood events influenced the choice of profession, about the Soviet era, about human kindness. The discussion of the wedding was not just on the second, but on the 10th plan. But the conversation turned out to be sincere and heartfelt. And by feelings, Jenkins brought the future relatives closer, despite their difference in age, education, and social status. After all, that was the purpose of the joint dinner. So at least, reasoned Miranda. Parted at 0 o'clock for the city elders left by cab. David stayed at the bride's apartment. They are sunny, sent the parents to bed, and themselves cleaned the table, went through the dishes, tidied up the living room and kitchen. The guy thought that he was obliged to help the future relatives, at least in this, since he was not allowed to help in the organization of the dinner, which was held for him, and therefore he did not know that, returning home, his mother said to her husband, "How do you like that? John, we're going to have a hereditary Jewess in our family, and from a family with a criminal record. I was hoping David would find a better match." "Okay," John responded to you. He didn't pick anything. He's in love with this thread and her family wholeheartedly. Do you care if she's Jewish or Turkish with a criminal record or a spotless one? They have plenty of money, pensions for doctors of sciences, a decent apartment. You've seen for yourself what a great party they are in material terms. And you and I don't need anything else. We decided to get married in 6 months in September. I didn't want beautiful fall photos under the dress. David was not against it, and parents amicably decided not to hinder the newlyweds and not to impose their ideas about the celebration. While the bride and groom were saving money for the party, outfits, treats, and a bachelorette party, it was decided long ago that after the wedding, the young people will live at Jenkins and save money for the down payment on the mortgage. And they should have thought about their careers. Both boys had little seniority, couldn't afford to borrow much money from the bank, and the salaries were not such that painlessly pay off the loan for housing. Miranda and Sebastian were completely satisfied with this solution. They found it reasonable in their large apartment with 3 isolated rooms. There was enough space for both parents and the young family. But the out-of-towners didn't like the idea for some reason. But openly, they did not express their protests. John, in mail conversations with Sebastian, he periodically complained that the son does not act according to the rules. They said that a man should bring his wife to his house and not move to her. Jenkins on these speeches only guffawed. It's all prejudice and long out of date. John came in, on the other hand. But a young family, come to think of it, they want to make some noise sometimes. But during this very time, and there are parents behind the wall, you have to admit, it's embarrassing. Imagine yourself in such a situation and will never have grandchildren. You've been here, John. Sebastian wondered. From the thread and the room to our half of the apartment. How noisy do you have to be for us to hear, unless you yell into a microphone? Would the guests want to invite us to a party? I guess, John. People need a place to gather with their friends. Or they'll just sit up late watching TV, and you'll be noisy at 0 o'clock. We're fine, smiled Jenkins. Yeah, agreed, was John. I remember Miranda wasn't used to being kept up at night by the noise from the in-laws. Sebastian gave his companion a serious look, raised an eyebrow questioningly. I mean that she could endure the inconvenience for a long time for the sake of the people closest to her and not say anything to them about it. Tactfully, I'm a woman, John quickly mouthed and curtailed the subject. There was no need to quarrel with the future in-laws yet. Kelly was more subtle. Over a cup of tea, she could complain to Miranda. David, the other day, my boy was frying cutlets. I come in. Oh my goodness. The whole kitchen smoky. The stove's got grease on the coffee. Splashes on the table, flour scattered. and he sits in front of a mountain of cutlets and says I'm treating my mom. And he doesn't notice what he's turned the kitchen into. You have to be such a Bezrukov. Grown-ups are already on the torture. You're with him, Miranda. Not scared. He was joking. Kelly, you haven't seen what goes on in our kitchen. After Sebastian's fish fry. The man is incorrigible. Kelly nodded, but by the next meeting, she'd start all over again, all over me. Would you be comfortable living with Slovaks? After all, a stranger in the house, and besides, a young man just so from the morning from the bedroom in a nightgown will not jump out of the bedroom. I have never been in the habit of jumping out of the bedroom unclothed, Miranda objected softly. David is no stranger to us. He stayed overnight, or on weekends more than once. We've never been inconvenienced. Don't worry, Kelly. No worries at all. It's one thing to have him as a guest, and quite another to have him as a permanent resident. And that you're getting tired of this topic being mooted. You guys can't have a life. You yourself understand it perfectly well. And to rent an apartment, it is not rational at their incomes that the newlyweds settled for the city could not be out of the question. Everyone understood that. The David family lived in a 2-room adjoining Khrushchevka, where the guy owned a passageway room. When he was a teenager, he tried to persuade his father to make repairs and isolate his room. But John quickly explained to his son the unreality of this idea. Expensive, messy, troublesome. The room would be cramped. The apartment will be blocked by a dark, long corridor, which is not used rationally. In addition, because of this, redevelopment will reduce the living area of their Khrushchevka, which will lead to a drop in its value. In short, unprofitable from all sides. David then reconciled, blocked off part of the room with a closet, thus allocating himself a personal space, and about the repair shut up. Later, getting acquainted with Robert, he sometimes regretted that he did not show insistence to bring the girl in a separate room. Although tiny, it still goes anywhere, but in the country behind the closet is simply impossible. The current hints of David's parents only annoyed, especially since for the city expressed their thoughts not only Jenkins Sr., but also Netta. For example, one day Kelly took the future daughter-in-law to the cat show, and their threads looked at one of the kittens, a red and fluffy Maine Coon. The girl more than half an hour stood near his cage, admiring and pleasing. So let's buy him, Kelly suggested. I'll add to you if you don't have enough. You can't, sighed Lisa. Dad's allergic to cats. Then get the breeder's contacts and buy one after the wedding, Kelly suggested. And then, as if she'd come to her senses, she added, "Oh, you'll be living with your parents anyway. If only you had your own apartment." Slowly, Kelly and John put their future daughters-in-law into the family's heads. The idea that the young ones needed their own place. Eventually, Miranda got fed up with it. She summoned the town's spouses for a talk, and she called David and Robert and her husband. "Kelly, John," she began, "we've all noticed that you don't like the prospect of David living in our apartment after the wedding. Let's discuss this situation once and for all. First, let's admit to each other that we have no alternatives. The young people will not be able to live with you. This will inevitably lead to domestic conflicts. We are not in a position to buy an apartment. We don't have that kind of money. We do not intend to exchange our existing housing. You, as far as I understand, you also do not have the financial means to evict David. Otherwise, you would have done it a long time ago." John shook his head. "No," he admitted, "except for a down payment. We could scrape together a studio of some kind." "Not a studio," Lisa resented. "If you're going to mess with the mortgage, then buy a full-fledged apartment, albeit one room these to fly. Where is the room combined with the kitchen? Well, we'd probably add something to your money for a down payment, but we don't have a lot of money. I warn you, we'll get a one-room Khrushchevka somewhere in the suburbs, and the guys are still more comfortable living in the center. It's not far to work, and there's all the infrastructure. They can't rent an apartment and save for a mortgage at the same time. So, I believe, moving in with us, David, is the only sensible decision. especially since the children made it themselves. We expect it won't be for long. David cut in. 5 years at the most. But that's me calculating the worst-case scenarios. Moreover, said Sebastian, we will help by providing housing and not requiring the kids to contribute to the household expenses, so as not to slow down the rate of savings. But I would object to the expenses, said David. I don't like to be a freeloader, and we will discuss it. If necessary, Miranda responded immediately. That's what the situation looks like so far. Maybe you see some other ways to solve it that the four of us don't see. She turned to Kelly with John, for the townspeople looked at each other, shrugged confusedly. Not yet, it seemed, Kelly said. In that case, let's consider it a done deal, Jenkins summarized. And please don't start any more conversations about how inconvenient it is for anyone or how wrong it is in general. It's tedious and uncomfortable, Smith's words added, and almost with glee. Kelly and John had to agree before the wedding. They kept their heads down and didn't broach the subject of bridal real estate again. All the more did not remember the idea to organize on the day of their marriage. For Kelly and John, the future mother-in-law was only in favor, but he himself categorically did not want a second ceremony. Realizing that the man cannot change his mind, Lisa said, well, and the hell with it, come up with something more interesting. And came up with as a bachelorette party arranged all the close women, including Miranda and Kelly, masked photo shoot in wedding dresses. For this event, she invited several makeup artists and hairdressers, conspired with a rental salon to provide outfits and space, and with a nearby restaurant, about a small buffet. The ladies were a little shy at first, but the champagne abundance of outfits around did their job. Soon, everyone invited, with pleasure and excitement, tried on dresses, posed for photographers, tested unusual makeup. The party turned out very girlish and yet romantic. No, she was pleased. And Kelly later told her in confidence that even re-registration with her husband would not have given her so much joy and pleasure. In short, there was no time to discuss where the new family would live. However, John had prepared a surprise for the wedding dinner. The dinner was modest. Only the young people and their parents celebrated the marriage. With friends, David and Robert decided the next day, and immediately after the registry office and photo shoot went with their relatives to a cozy restaurant, David, in the city of excellent cuisine and service of extra class. When the turn came to handing out gifts, the new father-in-law solemnly rose from his seat and said, guys, I decided as a gift to buy you an apartment. Here are the documents. He held out to the newlyweds a thin folder. I thought, he continued, that my savings are enough either for a ready-made studio or a 2-bedroom. But for the construction phase, I mean the down payment. Of course, I wouldn't be able to afford the whole thing. But so far my earnings are stable, and one good contract should be coming up soon. So I got in touch with a real estate developer. And now we have a 2-room apartment near the center. True, the house is still at the foundation stage, but the builder is reliable. I checked. It's scheduled for completion in 2 years. They're giving it to you with renovation. Just move in and live. Once it's built, now we'll register the house with you. In the meantime, the loan is on me, and I'll pay. It's a gift after all. The news made a lot of noise around the table. Robert and her husband and parents went to see the house under construction a couple of days later. The new building was indeed very well located in the so-called quiet center. The neighborhood was green and cozy. Not far from the house were stores of basic necessities, kindergarten, school. There was a prospective apartment in the next block. Sebastian grinned, and with grandchildren will be comfortable to live. And the manager who accompanied them would also confirm. We have in the project provides wheelchairs on the first floor, ramps at each porch, and a great playground in a closed courtyard. And the whole territory is under video surveillance. You can even let one child go for a walk and not worry about his safety. Jenkins' senior impression and nodded approvingly. She didn't let this information pass her ears. She looked at the floor plans with curiosity, looked for her future apartment on the floor plan. And when she found it, It seems that she immediately began to arrange the furniture there in her imagination. A representative of the developer took the families to a neighboring building, recently commissioned by his company. Some of the apartments in it were still empty, and it was possible to get inside and look at the renovation by the builders, and generally assess the quality of housing. After this trip, even David, who had previously been skeptical about his father's gift, felt grateful to John and began to dream of moving. "Great," Sebastian exclaimed on the way home. "Here he was being a friend to you, and here's a royal gift for you guys. But for now, he's not splurging too much." "It's cool," Miranda noticed. "At the foundation stage, these apartments are cheap enough. Not a penny, of course. But for our 3-bedroom, we can get 3 2-bedrooms like this. He'll splurge later when he starts paying off the loan." I suggested to my father that we pay off the loan. David responded immediately, but he refused. He said it was his gift. It was the best we could do. "What is this? Us taking over the mortgage after we move in? When the apartment's built, when it's finished, my dad'll transfer it to us. We'll live and pay for it then. Until then, he's on his own." "Is it a big payment?" asked Sebastian, and hearing the amount, whistled delightedly. "Almost my entire pension," shocked the matchmaker. "He says that as long as his income allows," David explained. "Yes, he is also counting on some contract with Europe, which will supposedly provide him and my mom with income for eternity. I don't know much about his business affairs," finished the young man, a little embarrassed. "You don't need it. You have your own work to do," Miranda reassured her son-in-law. "But God willing, it will all work out. Basically, nothing has changed yet," Lisa said thoughtfully. "We are still living with you and still saving money. Only now it's not for the mortgage, but for renovation and furniture. Let's see how this developer shows himself. Although it will be a pity, of course, if something is delayed." That was that. David settled down in Robert's room, moved his things and computer, and set up his own workspace. He really got along with his wife's parents without any problems. Of course, there were some little things in terms of everyday life, which had to get used to anew. But it was perceived and mighty with his father-in-law as an inevitable stage of lapping, and did not cause violent emotions. In general, the two families coexisted in one apartment quite peacefully. On weekdays, they did not see each other very often. The young ones worked late, and after work they usually went to some events like concerts in bars, theater performances, or just visiting friends. The older generation had their own thing going on. Sebastian continued to work part-time at his institute, and on weekends he went fishing, including in winter. Julia counseled privately and worked with students, helping them write academic papers and conducting research. Officially, the Jenkins seniors were retired, but they could not imagine life without work. Once a month, the families would stop by the construction site and were pleased to see that the house where their apartment would be located was coming up. The construction was strictly on schedule, and in some aspects even ahead of schedule. And David and Robert gradually got used to the idea that they would live here. Little by little they got acquainted with the neighborhood, planned the situation in the future housing. Even Robert's parents had already accepted the idea and were discussing their children's plans with no less enthusiasm than they were. Nothing foreshadowed trouble. Moreover, John made regular installments on the loan to the builder. Thus passed about half a year. Towards spring, the Jenkins noticed that John had become nervous and anxious. Sebastian called him for a conversation and learned that the conclusion of the contract with European partners, on which the man had pinned so much hope, for some reason stalled. "We'll have to tighten our belts, it seems," sighed the matchmaker. "With the current customer, we have a contract ends in May. Will he renew it or not? We don't know yet, and it's not a very convenient customer. In general, he will get discounts from us when renewing. How's that sound? And where will I get them from? We're already working with him at almost cost price. I also bought some equipment specifically for the Europeans. The money is spent, and the equipment is idle." They didn't know what John Jenkins was doing. Even David couldn't explain to them the specifics of his father's company, some kind of small production. But what kind of manufacturing? What does it produce and who does it sell to? No one knew. John himself, starting to talk about the work, began to rush with obscure terms, from which the interlocutors quickly tired. So his explanations did not add clarity. But Sebastian understood the holy financial crisis. "John, with the mortgage you pull so far or help?" he asked. "Pulled until God willing," the man responded. However, a couple months later, John came to Jenkins and said to Sebastian, "Listen, Saint, help. I can't take any more credit. I scraped together the last pennies for the last payment, and I don't know where to get money for the next one. I work alone. You know, Kelly, we're all looking out for ourselves. She's no help at all." "What are you talking about, John?" Sebastian exclaimed. "I'll help, of course. We're not strangers. And the apartment is being built not only for your son, but also for my daughter. Tell me where to transfer and by what date. I'll do it." "Thanks, my brother-in-law helped me out. By next month I'll have it up and running," John promised. "Oh, and don't tell the kids, please. It's embarrassing. He said it was a small gift for the wedding, and now he's left with nothing." "I won't tell," Sebastian reassured his relative. "I'm not going to tell you, I guess. I have a stash that my wife doesn't know about, just for such occasions, so don't worry. We'll save your reputation." John thanked Jenkins profusely. He promised it was just a one-time thing. By the next installment, everything would be fine. But it turned out that Sebastian paid for the apartment under construction for the next year. John returned his money to him only twice, and then, not completely discouraged, and with the crisis in his company, David and Robert said nothing. The guys continued to travel regularly to the construction site and plan the move. The building where their future apartment was located was already erected, and they were excitedly measuring the floor among the still bare concrete walls and deciding where to put the sofa, where to place the table, and in which corner a floor lamp would look better. Jenkins didn't want to deprive them of this joy, but Miranda had to confess her collusion with the saint. There is no wife who doesn't know about her spouse's stash, even if it's kept in a bank account and managed solely from a private office. Miranda noticed that her husband began to look more often than usual into the internet bank, which he had not used before, that by a certain day of the month he began to check the status of his cards, to transfer something somewhere. She didn't bother with suspicions. She just asked directly. Sebastian, who was not used to having secrets from his wife, gave in at once. Jenkins listened to the story, thought a little, and said thoughtfully, "God forbid that everything should be all right," and ended with an incomprehensible phrase for her husband: "Good that you transfer the money from your account, not cash." However, Sebastian did not pay attention to this remark. A few more months passed before John showed up at Jenkins with a penitent look. He arrived on a weekend when the entire population of the apartment and the younger and older ones were home. Gathering everyone in the kitchen, he began to get upset. "Came to apologize, comrades. The contract I had so hoped for is obviously no more. With old clients, my contracts are over. All in all, my firm is almost bankrupt. I've decided to sell it for a blood loss. I'm sorry, guys, I know I promised you, but I'm not holding out." "How do you mean sell it?" David was surprised. "What do you mean?" "Directly," John said sadly. "I'll put it up for sale under an assignment agreement, so sell it to us. Lisa found it right away. We will continue to pay off the loan." "And what will I use to pay off my work debts?" John sighed. "I can't charge you for the apartment. I'll take it from an outside buyer, especially since I already have one in mind. But I'm sorry, guys, I know you were hoping. But I promise you, as soon as things get better, I'll buy you a better apartment than this one." Robert and David and Sebastian. There was a lot of noise for a while, suggesting options. Miranda was silent, scrutinizing the matchmaker. Sebastian came out to escort John to the entrance and asked in a low voice, "Hey, matchmaker, and my money, which I gave for the loan, Will you give back from the sale? We'll decide, said the city quickly. I'm in a hurry. I'm running. A longing settled in the Jenkins apartment. The young people were upset and discouraged. They were too used to thinking of this new building as their own. They had too many plans for it. Sebastian was worried about the money he'd spent for nothing. John, after apologizing, hadn't visited in over a month, and he was unavailable by phone. Kelly made long conversations, but did not report on her husband's affairs, claiming that she knew nothing about them. One evening, after making sure the children were firmly entrenched in their room, Miranda called her husband into the kitchen and handed him some printouts. What are these? Sebastian asked, puzzled. It's data from the Rosary Store website, she explained. John, our faraway sold. Even before he repented to us, he came the day before. He didn't mention the debts. He didn't say anything to you. When I asked him, he said we'll figure it out. That's all. Sebastian studied the documents, then shook his head in confusion. He's a fraud, our matchmaker, sadly, Miranda summarized. Why did you jump right in? Sebastian, the man's in a financial crisis. What's in it for him? He embarrassed himself. He embarrassed himself in front of his kids. He doesn't give a damn about his kids or ours. Miranda was angry. And Sebastian's benefit is very simple and transparent. He bought this apartment at the foundation stage 1.5 years ago. Since then, and the dollar rate has grown, and the situation on the real estate market has changed, and the apartment has gone up. I saw it myself. The house is almost ready. Now this 2-bedroom is $6 million more expensive than when he bought it. I checked. Look at this. John took out a loan with no down payment. There was a developer's promotion, and he only made 5 6-month payments. So he didn't spend more than $200,000. And now he sold the apartment, paid off the rest of the loan, and got about $4 million. That's a nice profit. In 1.5 years with that kind of investment, it's a good profit, Sebastian agreed. But what makes you think it's fraud? That he thought it all out in advance and acted, as they say, in self-interest. Yes, if only because he hasn't paid you back yet. Even though he has the money from the sale, Miranda replied reasonably. It's been a month, by the way. And he hasn't even shown his face to us. Everyone hides during that time. Apparently, he's not going to give anything back. What was the point of the whole show to promise the kids an apartment? He could have just bought it for himself, waited for it to go up in value and sold it. Sebastian, but you're like a little kid, really. The woman didn't know whether to be angry or upset. Without the show, he'd have to pay the mortgage himself. So most of his mortgage was paid for. You figure you're paying for your daughter's house. Sebastian didn't have time to answer. The door opened and David came into the kitchen. David, I'm sorry, he said, slightly embarrassed, but more wary. I overheard part of your conversation. Sebastian, is that right? You paid the mortgage instead of your father. Jenkins nodded. And he didn't pay you back? The boy kept asking. Sebastian shook his head. David lowered his eyes. He was quiet for a moment. We have some savings, he said. Finally, how much does your father owe you? I can pay you back that money. There are savings and well, grumbled Sebastian. Let it sit. It'll come in handy. A son can't answer for his father, can he? The man winked mockingly at his son-in-law. And I'll pay for my mistakes myself. Maybe I'll still be able to persuade John. Let me talk to him myself, David suggested. It's easier for me. I don't think he's hiding from me. Talk if you want to, Miranda nodded. I don't think so. Are you really going to convince him of anything? That money wasn't good for us, Sebastian explained. I mean, it wasn't the last money we gave him. No offense, it was just a rainy day fund. You know, age. You gotta be prepared for all sorts of illnesses and stuff. But it's a shame. David, you know. I understand, nodded the guy. I'm offended and ashamed too. I thought you were going to call me out of the house after all this, and Robert. I'll talk to my dad. He finished and stalked out of the kitchen. John really wasn't hiding from his son, but he laughed at his requests to return the money he paid Jenkins. "What money are you talking about?" He was surprised. "I didn't borrow from him. I didn't give him any receipts. I didn't promise to pay him back. He offered to help me when he found out about my difficulties. So I took him up on it. So he thought he was paying the rent for me and the thread." The boy objected. "But what did he think?" stretched John mockingly. "Yes, I promised you that apartment, but I overdid it. I didn't calculate my possibilities. But it was registered to me, so I'm the owner. I bought it when I wanted, sold it when I wanted. What's your beef? So you bought it with someone else's money?" David was outraged. "And why someone else's?" "Explain," shook his head father. "A relative helped me. A close person. Do you consider him a stranger too? You live in his house, don't you? Aren't you ashamed? So pay back your relative." David tried his best to speak calmly, not reacting to his father's taunts. "And you proved that it was a debt." John grinned. "There was no debt. It was voluntary contributions. That was nice of the family. There was no debt." At last the men shouted at each other, and their conversation turned into a real quarrel. David achieved nothing for his father-in-law, but firmly promised his father that until Sebastian got his money back, he would not communicate with his father. A great loss. John followed the offspring. That night he called Jenkins and expressed his displeasure. "What are you, a matchmaker? You're turning my son against me," he said reproachfully. "I thought you were in my position. I agree to wait while I sort out my finances, and you not only started to beat your pennies out of me, but also David against me. I didn't expect that kind of meanness." The conversation was on speakerphone. Sebastian was fiddling with a word at the moment of the call and his hands were dirty. David, hearing his father's complaints, was lazy. "How can you have a conscience?" he shouted into the phone. "You're a liar and a cheat. We'll sue you in court, you say," snorted John. "Son against father. But sue over laughing lawyers." And he disconnected. "Uncle Sebastian, I think you should really file a complaint against him," David said, in a passionate voice. "He won't give the money back in kind." "David, what's the point of all this squabbling?" Jenkins said sadly. "You and your father are going to get in trouble. Honestly, I don't want anything to do with him." After that, he left David with a thread to play on our nerves. "Lied to your eyes. Deprived you of your savings. He thought I might lose my beloved wife after such tricks. What are you doing with Miranda? You won't let me in the door. Like hell you wouldn't." He didn't care. "I don't want anything to do with him." After that. "Don't get hot, David, don't get hot," Sebastian reassured him. Not sure what else to say, but his son-in-law had already decided to act. The firm where David worked as an engineer had a legal department. He went there, described his situation to the staff, and asked them to recommend a good lawyer who could help his family recover a debt from his ex-family. "In principle, I could do it," said one of the trust employees, Charles, thoughtfully. "I've dealt with similar situations before, but I'd have to talk to yours first." "I could do it today," the guy said cheerfully. "Just Charles, if you need anything. You work for my father-in-law for free. As a friendship, so to speak, and we'll settle the fee issue separately, if we win the case or even bring the court costs from the defendant." "Don't worry," smiled the lawyer, "but I accept the deal. You don't want to worry the old people." "So, they are already worried," sighed David. Charles did not spend too long talking to Jenkins. First of all, he clarified for himself how Sebastian had made the payment on David's loan to his father. When he found out that the money was transferred directly to the mortgage account from Sebastian's card, he was happy. "That's great," he exclaimed. "This is direct evidence that you transferred funds to the defendant. And not just for nothing, but for specific purposes. Receipts of transfers prove that you participated in the purchase of his apartment, so you're entitled to a share of the sale. Print them out for me, please." Sebastian was hesitant to sue his son-in-law's father. It seemed awkward to him, but his wife and David convinced him. And the man that same evening, with the help of Charles, wrote a pre-trial complaint to John. The document was sent by registered mail, but there was no response from the city. Then Sebastian, again with the assistance of a lawyer, wrote a statement of claim. To it, they enclosed copies of documents on the apartment and the extract from Roserister, found in the network Miranda, and receipts for transfers, and a copy of the claim and a receipt for sending it. The lawyer took all these papers to the district court the next day. Additionally, David attached to the package of documents a flash drive with audio recording of his conversation with his father voice recorder in his phone. He then turned it on just in case. Knowing the character of John, he could agree to something and a day later refused to retract his words. The guy thought the recording would help him avoid that. He didn't even think about a trial at that time. But the audio came in handy. Charles said it would be another argument in Jenkins' favor. The trial took several months and cost the family a lot of heartache. Kelly and John regularly called the Jenkinses and asked them to settle the case amicably. They offered to wait. They threatened, tried to scandalize. But Sebastian and Miranda were adamant, although the elderly woman often had to take sedatives after such calls. They upset her too much. Miranda was too worried that she couldn't see the true nature of her new relatives in time. "Mom, why were you soothing her? Robert, you're not a psychic after all. How could you have known there was so much dirt in them?" "Exactly. David, I've been around them for years, and I didn't expect this kind of meanness. They're my parents." "You don't understand," Jenkins joked. "This is a big professional setback for me. I'm a psychologist with a long experience, with a doctorate. And it's unthinkable to misjudge people like this. Psychologist, you've been exhorting on the job. And outside of work, you're an ordinary woman. And like every human being, you have the right to make a mistake. So give yourself permission to exercise it." Miranda nodded, agreed. But each subsequent call threw her off balance. Not for nothing. Oh, not for nothing. She'd been so worried before her first visit for the city's scarecrow of heart to their home. She thought, but all things must come to an end. So did litigation. The Jenkins won the battle. The court ordered John to pay the full amount Sebastian spent on his loan, plus legal fees. It took some more time to fight with the bailiffs, who were supposed to collect the money and return it to its rightful owners. David was already at war with this service. Sebastian had no time to bother the bailiffs on a daily basis, and his health no longer allowed him to perform such active and energetic actions. So David appointed himself the legal representative of his father-in-law. 3 months passed after the court decision came into legal force. When the money finally arrived in the Jenkins account, the message about the deposit was read to Sebastian at dinner and was greeted with applause by the family. "I checked at the bank office, and everything is indeed in order," the man said. "And I was thinking, since we have such a sum, and you have some savings, should we not get involved in the mortgage again? Only now we're going to do it by the book. Miranda and I will give you a down payment. You'll make more of your own, won't you? You'll be able to buy a 2-bedroom. Not as luxurious as in that new building, but quite decent. After all, a young family should live in their own home. Is that what you wanted?" "To be honest," Sebastian hesitantly began David, "we didn't really want to sit around. It was Aunt Kelly who gave me a headache, a vacation, and I'm so into this new apartment. But I actually like it better at home. I'm used to it. And so is David. Not if we're disturbing you." "What are you? Lisa?" Miranda exclaimed. "You're not disturbing us at all, but it's for your convenience." The young couple looked at each other, and there was a certain cunning in their glances. "But if it's for our convenience," said Lisa in a slightly strained voice, "then hold on. For our convenience, it would be better not to move out, but to live together with you, because David and I are going to have a child soon, and we are counting on your help with him." She looked at the changed face of her parents and added in the tone of a mom, "Well, please, I'm afraid that I won't be able to cope with the baby alone." "What's the conversation about?" Lisa Sebastian was glowing with happiness. "We'll help you with your grandson. Don't worry. The mother will refuse. I'm still good for something. Why would I refuse? Miranda smiled. I'm very much in favor. I'm not used to staying awake at night at the bedside of my loved ones. Just Lisa, for God's sake. Don't send the father to register the baby, and don't send David either. Just in case. Believe me, in my experience, it's a matter for the mother to handle on her own.
Subscribe and click the bell.
Helen could barely hold back her tears again. She believed again for the umpteenth time that everything would still be okay. But Adriana and her daughter Jenna, now they will once again put Helen in front of her father. A stupid, spoiled brat who has a hard time going through adolescence. I knew, of course, that tough period. Rolled Adriana's eyes in front of her upset spouse. But what is Helen doing going downhill? If you only knew how hard it is for me to keep her in line. It wasn't like that with Jenna. I know you do a lot for Helen, and I appreciate it. The father spoke with his eyes downcast, ashamed of his daughter, of her supposedly ugly behavior. And the most frustrating thing was that it was useless to explain to him. Helen had tried many times to convey to her family that Adriana was constantly denigrating her. When her father is not at home, her stepmother humiliates her, floods her with endless errands, does not let her study, meet with friends, do her favorite things. But Adriana is a virtuoso at manipulating people and a wonderful actress. Besides, she always manages to turn the father against his daughter. She picks up such words that after them all explanations and arguments of Helen seem to the man pathetic, excuses, and attempts to cast aspersions on a holy woman who pulls someone else's difficult child. So now Helen will not even try to prove to her father that she is not guilty of anything. It would get her nowhere. The girl sat on her bed, crammed into the very corner, and tucked her face into a huge teddy bear. She was given it by her grandmother's neighbor, David. Helen was 7 years old at the time. How thrilled was she when she saw her neighbor with the big toy in his hands. He walked into their house, as always, with a big smile on his face. It was the most wonderful time. I wish I could go back there, remembered her grandmother. Helen smiled. Yes, the girl was endlessly longing for a family member who loved her and accepted her completely. Grandmother surrounded her only granddaughter with warmth and care. She talked to her a lot, hugged her often, but she's gone. Helen has been around for almost 5 years. Grandmother Faith did not become when the girl was 10. And since then, Helen's life has changed a lot, and not for the better. But Helen's childhood was simply wonderful. Despite the fact that the girl did not know her own mother, she felt quite happy under her grandmother's wing. Helen's mom died right after she gave birth to her first and only long-awaited child. Some unforeseen complications from the birth. There was nothing the doctors could do. And so it was that Stephen, Helen's father, found himself with an infant in his arms. He loved his wife very much and could not recover from her loss for a long time. What to do with a newborn baby? Stephen had no idea. He was scared to even hold his daughter in his arms. Good thing his mother was there for him. At this difficult moment, she took the girl to the great relief of a confused son, completely absorbed in his own grief. At first, the grandmother lived in a city apartment orphaned into the life of the family. Helen's mother had no parents for a long time. They died when she was still a student. Stephen worked as a mechanic on a fishing boat and often went on voyages, and he was not particularly eager to take care of babies. So Helen was left in the full care of her grandmother. At first, the grandmother tried to establish a connection between the daughter and the father. She wanted Stephen to take care of the baby himself, not that it was difficult for the grandmother. No, it's just the right thing to do, the right thing to do. But the man wouldn't hear of it. He was in grief, and he blamed his daughter for what happened to his beloved wife. Helen realized this later when she was older. For a long time, her father thought that it would be better if he and his wife lived without children at all, traveled, paid all their attention to each other, and were happy. Stephen was very much in love with his young, beautiful wife and was experiencing the loss of her. Long and hard. In the end, Grandma was tired of being the link between Stephen and Helen. She had long wanted to go to her small homeland in a cozy house under a green roof in the village. and she had a lot of things to do there. A vegetable garden, chickens, cats, and a dog. For all this farm during the prolonged absence of grandmother looked after neighbor David. Of course, they had a good and warm relationship. Grandma has helped him out many times too. But it's time to do the honors. I'm sure you can't get through to a grown-up son. Grandma packed up little Helen and went home with her. Stephen was only too glad for this turn of events. The baby clearly annoyed him and reminded him of the tragedy with its mere appearance. Besides, the man had to go on a long voyage soon, which also pleased him. Waves of socializing with coworkers is hard physical labor. Stephen hoped that all this would help him to distract himself from the heavy thoughts. In part, by the way, it did. And the grandmother, with its inherent energy included in the care of the little granddaughter Diaper Duke Shanko, walks with a stroller. It was as if she felt like a young mother again, only now she was already enjoying motherhood with full commitment. When her own son Stephen was a baby, the woman did not realize what happiness it is, a child. She had to deal with a whole bunch of things at once, to rebuild the life in a small village house, to finish studying at the local college, and to work part-time. Those were hard times. Now she's an old woman. She gave all her time, all her attention, all her warmth to Helen. Looking at the girl, she felt a mixture of pinched tenderness and acute pity. How can it be such a tiny girl has already been left without a mother? And the father, it seems, does not burn with desire to deal with his daughter. The son's behavior was very upsetting. A caring grandmother. But she hoped that she could fix everything. Helen grew up a sweet and trouble-free child with few illnesses. She did everything on time and sat up and walked and talked. Her grandmother couldn't get enough of her. The girl grew up surrounded by friendly people, from whom only warmth and acceptance came. First of all, of course, her grandmother. She was the most important person for Helen. Reliable, caring, kind, always understand, always support. She opened the world to her granddaughter, talked to her a lot about everything in the world, explained complicated things to her. Helen did not remember that once her grandmother brushed off her questions, as it usually happens with adults. You won't understand yet. You will when you grow up. Go away. I don't have time for you right now. There had never been anything like that between Grandma and Helen. It was like they understood each other without words. And Grandmother also had friends and neighbors, and they too participated in Helen's upbringing. The girl went to visit them, made friends with their grandchildren. There were times when a bunch of children ran from house to house, where they would have breakfast together, where they would have lunch, where they would watch TV together. Someone's father would take a wonderful group to the river or to the woods. It was fun. The girl had a particularly warm relationship with David. His house stood opposite the grandmother's, and the elderly man often came to the neighbor to help her with men's chores. To fix a faucet, to fix the roof on the shed, to move a closet. And his grandmother would feed him delicious pies and treat him to huge cutlets. David was a widower. Helen, hearing this strange word for the first time, frowned thoughtfully, trying to understand what it meant. Grandmother explained, of course, there was no one to bake pies for the neighbor. Of course, the man was perfectly able to cope with the billet with hunger, did not die. But he never learned the art of baking. Already later, Helen realized that, apparently, the neighbor felt for her grandmother not only friendly feelings. Why not? He's a widower. The neighbor's husband had also died long ago, but her grandmother. She probably decided to devote her whole life to her granddaughter without distractions for anything else. The old woman had big plans for Helen's future. She did a lot with the girl, put all her soul into her, and thought that she would be with her granddaughter for a long time and would teach her and marry her, and even help her with her great-grandchildren. It didn't work out. About childhood. Thanks to her grandmother, the girl has the warmest memories. Helen especially loved summer. That's a really cheerful, carefree couple. Her granddaughters Kathy and Maria came to David for vacations. They were Helen's best friends. She'd been looking forward to them all year. The girls had been together all day, and the three of us were never bored. But still they, in the company of other village kids, liked to spend time on bicycles, raced to the river, and went to the forest. They played hide and seek and catch up. They told scary stories in the evenings and played soccer barefoot. We crawled home, tired, grimy, but happy. Often the children slept over at Helen's grandmother's. She never refused her granddaughter. If the girl asked to leave someone to sleep over, there was plenty of room in the house. The children chatted and giggled all night. But the grandmother did not reprimand them. She understood how fun and great it was. Helen, of course, realized early on that she was living a different life than the other children at other people's houses. They didn't all have fathers, but they had moms. Mothers were all kinds of young and grown-up beautiful, and not very strict and kind. They were always there for their kids, and dads too. Of course, Helen started asking her grandmother questions early on. Well, that, and had to tell the girl about what had happened. Carefully, very carefully, the woman told the little girl the story of her birth. Helen did not know her mom, so she was not too upset. Especially the grandmother said that mom was now in heaven and was helping her daughter from there. It was like a beautiful fairy tale, but every now and then a longing for something beautiful and unfulfilled. A child's heart would clench. Helen sometimes imagined what it would be like to live a particular moment of life if mom were there. However, these thoughts did not particularly disturb the girl while she lived with her grandmother in the village. Helen was there warmly, cozily, well. Father, of course, he sometimes appeared at her mother's house. Always came on Helen's birthday with presents, if he wasn't on a voyage. And at least once every 2 months he visited his own. For Helen it was familiar and dear, but practically a stranger. A handsome young man with sad gray eyes, always trim, always beautifully dressed. He appeared with gifts of beautiful dolls, outfits, dresses, interesting books. Helen wondered how her father always manages to guess so accurately what she dreams about. Does it really read her mind? Then the girl realized that it was her grandmother who told her son what to buy for Helen in the city. The father came usually for a couple of days, less often, for a week or 2. He didn't know what to talk to his daughter about. He asked the usual questions about her studies, friends, and hobbies. The girl saw that he wasn't particularly interested in any of that. Not like David. The one loved to listen, told him about the adventures of village children. He laughed, recalled some episodes from his childhood. Unobtrusively gave important advice. The elderly neighbor was just a wonderful listener. But he asked his father only because he had to. Helen understood this even as a very young girl. The girl really wanted to please her father, to interest him, at least something to please him, after all. But in vain. All Helen's attempts were shattered by the indifference of this man. He diligently performed his paternal duties. Duties transferred money to his mother, bought necessary things for the house. When he came to visit, he was engaged in the vegetable garden and repairs. But did it all out of a sense of duty. Mental affection between him and his daughter never appeared. The grandmother tried to bring up her son, explained to him how to behave with the girl. The adults thought Helen was asleep, but she heard everything. A girl needs a father's attention in a low voice, the mother explained to her son. She's growing up. Come and visit her often, or go on vacation with her and fly to the sea. You know, Mom, I work hard all the time. I go on voyages. I earn money. By the way, Helen for the future, just the present is often forgotten. Sadly, sighed Grandma. I don't forget? No. I see how well you're doing. Helen is happy with you. What can I give her? I'm still a little upset myself. Helen, even though she was still very young, realized that she was burdening her father with her very existence. No, he won't take her on vacation or have her father visit her more often. He is better off on his own, without her and without her grandmother of some incomprehensible lonely life. It was a shame. Helen, you loved your only parent very much to realize that your father didn't need you. It's scary and unpleasant. The girl even cried a little into her pillow, but in the morning she behaved as if nothing had happened. And then the father left, hugging his daughter, as always in farewell. I'm going on a long voyage, he warned. I won't see you for a long time. I won't be able to come to you on September 1. I'm sorry, that's all right. Carelessly waved her hand. She was not used to her father being absent at the most important moment of her life. No big deal. But her grandmother was always there for her. It was the summer before Helen's first grade. The girl remembered it well because in August she had a birthday party on which an important event took place. Grandma, as always, had set 2 tables in the garden, one for the children and one for their parents and grandparents. She always made her granddaughter's birthdays so crowded, cheerful, colorful, and she herself took great pleasure in socializing with the good people of the party. Both Helen and her grandmother looked forward to it all year long. David showed up a little later than the other guests. He gave Helen a huge teddy bear that his granddaughters Kathy and Maria helped him pick out. Helen was delighted when she saw the teddy bear. She had never had such a huge toy before. "Happy birthday!" Kathy and Maria rushed over to hug the birthday boy. "Thank you for." Helen clapped her hands. "What's that thing David's holding?" "I found a guitar in the attic the other day. I was sorting it out, thinking I'd throw it away, and I came across this instrument." "Sergeyevich, and I had forgotten that you are a musician," rejoiced grandmother. "Since when you haven't played, I guess. As soon as your wife died, you never picked up a guitar." "Yes, about 15 years have passed," nodded the neighbor. His eyes flashed with sadness. "I forgot about the guitar, and then suddenly I found it and remembered it." "Play us something," asked one of the adult guests. "Play it, play it." The kids picked up on it. Kathy and Maria studied proudly next to their grandfather. You bet, David had suddenly become the star of the party. Everybody's looking at him. How everyone asks him, "Why do you want to play ditties or what?" asked the man. Everyone murmured approvingly. Then David intercepted the guitar more comfortably, struck the strings with his fingers, and some magic began. Melodic sounds filled the garden, and Helen looked at her neighbor with her mouth open in amazement. How does he do this? How does this beautiful melody come about? The guests fell silent, looking at David. "Why are you singing? Come on, who's first? Who's the bravest?" The mother of a neighbor boy of one of Helen's friends started a thick bass ditty, and she sang something about 1000000, which is like a calf. The adults laughed, but Helen didn't get into the meaning of the ditty. She listened to the melody. The guests got into a frenzy. They ordered David more and more songs. And he, strangely enough, knew them all. Well, if he didn't know them, he quickly picked up the right tunes. The adults sang in an unstructured chorus. It was so wonderful, so funny, so beautiful. The children left the table and started a game of hide and seek. Of course, they called Helen too, but Helen couldn't tear herself away. She sat next to David and listened. And then suddenly, as if imperceptibly, began to sing along with the adults the words of the song about a wounded soldier she quickly learned. The guests sang, and it was probably the 3rd time. Mom was the first to notice it. "Listen," she suddenly said. "Do you hear how she sings?" The guests fell silent. Helen too. She was embarrassed to sing alone Glinka at her mother. Realized this and dragged out the song with her. It was easier for Helen that way. When the chords with milk broke out applause. "Well done." Helen was praised by the adults. "You sing well, not just good," shook her head. "The girl has talent. I'm telling you this as an employee of our House of Culture. Why did you hide such a treasure from us for so many years?" "I didn't know." The proud grandmother smiled. Since then, David became an even more frequent guest in the house of grandmother and granddaughter. And Helen herself now constantly ran to him. The man taught the girl many children's funny songs. Now she constantly hummed them everywhere at home in the vegetable garden, even on the way to the store. Why Helen had not realized before how great it was to sing. She didn't go to daycare as it was too far to drive her. Grandma didn't work anyway. Her granddaughter was already growing up with her. In the kindergarten, of course, the music worker would have noticed Helen's talent earlier. But at home, they had almost no music house. Grandmother usually included audiobooks, not songs. So it wasn't until Helen was 7 that she realized she incredibly enjoyed singing and music. "School will start. We'll give you to the House of Culture, my mother's Clinks. She says they have a good choir there. I even invite them to other cities for performances. You'll sing there. You can't bury such talent in the ground." Helen listened to her grandmother and looked forward to September. She wanted to go on stage. She wanted to be with people who shared her hobbies. The future seemed bright and fabulous. And then the girl asked David to teach her to play the guitar. He refused at first. "It's too early for you yet. Your fingers are small. Your hands are weak. You can't even hold such a big thing." But the neighbor was wrong. Helen was able to play the right chords the first time. Maria and Kathy even clapped their hands in joy for their friend. "See, Grandpa, she's doing it. Will you teach her?" "Of course I will." He scratched the back of his head in puzzlement. "David, where will you go?" Now the neighbor kept his promise. He now taught little Helen every day with a chord and everything he knew himself. The pupil was making great progress. Not only that the girl grasped everything on the fly, she also learned to pick up melodies. Of course, in this I do not know, David shared his observations with his grandmother Helen. But she seems to have an exceptional ear. She would be in music school. "That would be nice," sighed Grandma. "But we don't have it on Petrovka. There's only a choir here. And you can't go to the city every day. At least they'll take her to the choir." She promised, even though her granddaughter is still young, older kids sing there. And then came the long-awaited September 1. Helen still remembered how her grandmother proudly led her through the village streets by the hand to the school line. The girl was a little nervous, but it was a joyful excitement. She and her grandmother carefully prepared for the festive day. The day before they went to the city, where they chose the most beautiful things: lacquered shoes, dressy white blouse, puffy dark skirt. In the morning, the grandmother cried Helen tight braids, which she decorated with large white bows in the hands of her granddaughter. The woman slipped a beautiful bouquet, gladioluses. Helen even now remembered what delightful fragrance they exuded. Passers-by smiled. Grandmothers, dressed-up granddaughters, congratulated both of them on the beginning of their school journey. They wished the girl all A's. Helen thanked the people. She knew that there would be a party in the evening. Her grandmother had already invited the neighbor kids to visit and had made the dough for her special pies from the evening. Helen was also waiting for the beginning of classes at the House of Culture. She wanted so much to sing on stage. Helen's mom assured that Helen would really like the teacher. And so it turned out. Peter Andreevich highly appreciated the abilities of the new student. True, he did not let her down, despite her age. If the girl did not hit the notes or confused words, strictly reprimanded. But those were minor things. The main thing Helen felt in her element. Grandmother worried that the modest granddaughter is divided in front of the audience. But no, the little singer behaved on stage like a fish in water. First, Helen was put in the back, and then she began to perform solo. Peter Andreevich could not be pleased with his pupil. Such a gift is rare. He told his grandmother when she came to pick up her granddaughter. A real unlimited diamond. She should be in good hands. What do we have here? An ordinary village DK. Helen never gave up her guitar lessons either. It had already become a daily necessity for her. As a student, the girl had long ago surpassed her neighbor's teacher. But still, she went to visit David every day. In the first place, he had a guitar. In the second place, the neighbor could always give valuable and important advice about playing. But thirdly, no one Helen knew more about music than David. He would praise in a matter-of-fact way. He noticed subtleties. He sincerely admired the success of the little neighbor. Later, living with her father, Helen learned the expression soulmate. Probably she and David were these very soulmates. The neighbor replaced the grandfather Helen had never known, and maybe even her father at some points. As time went on, she grew up. She did well in school, performed with the choir. She continued to learn to play the guitar. Her father gave his daughter her own instrument for her birthday. Of course, it was his grandmother who gave him the gift idea. The girl had everything she needed to be happy. A caring grandmother, near understanding kind neighbors, loyal friends. Helen felt loved and native. In the village, she was her own and did not even think about moving to her father in the city. What to do there? Gray concrete boxes instead of houses, crowds of people rushing somewhere, who do not even look at each other. And her father was her own, but not at all familiar to her distant. People around her often said that there were more prospects in the city, that it would be much more interesting for the girl to grow up there. But Helen felt quite happy and satisfied with life. Her childhood had been warm, sunny, cozy. until that fateful day in February when David came to school to pick her up for some reason. Helen had long since gone to school and returned home alone. Her grandmother had accompanied her at first, but since the second grade, Helen had become quite independent. The road was not close, but in the company of friends and neighbors, time flew by. The girls walked and talked about everything. They laughed, discussed the details of the school day, made plans. And then suddenly there was a knock on the door during a literature lesson. A quiet conversation between the teacher and someone who hadn't crossed the threshold. And then the teacher's worried eyes. Her quiet request, "Helen, get ready for you, your neighbor is here." Helen felt the stares of everyone in the class fixed on her. That was how unusual this was. When Helen saw David, she knew something terrible had happened. The blank stare, the gray color of his face. The hands of the always calm man nodded slightly. Grandmother immediately guessed Helen. Her heart was squeezed with an icy hand and alarm. In that instant, the girl realized that Grandma was the whole world to her. The man nodded silently. "What's wrong with her?" "She's not well. They took her to the hospital." About her grandmother being gone. David said the girls are only at home. The woman suddenly got sick, had a heart attack. She crouched on a bench in the house, thinking to wait it out. This is how she was caught by a neighbor who came to borrow some eggs. They immediately called an ambulance, but the doctors who arrived could only state the fact of death. So Helen was left alone, all alone in the world. That night she was taken in by her neighbor Clara. She and her grandmother were close friends. In the company of a kind-hearted woman and her grandchildren, Helen was not so dreary, as if she was alone at home. But the girl was still in some incomprehensible state. Everything that was happening seemed unreal to her. This simply could not happen. How so? Grandma's gone. So what? She'll never be gone again. Never again. My father was on a voyage and he was informed, of course. But it took time to get to the big land. The man didn't even make it to the funeral organized by the neighbors. In those terrible days, Helen somehow did not think about her future. She cried a lot, often talking to the neighbors about her grandmother. They knew and loved her. They said nice things about her. That made the girl feel a little better. And then her father arrived, awkwardly hugged his daughter, and said the words that made Helen once again shrink from pain. That the daughter would now mean living together in the city. Like in the city. Why in the city? Helen did not want to leave the new Petrovka at all. Grandmother, of course, is gone and will never be. But here is the school, here are friends, here are neighbors, here is the choir. After all, here is David, who will always support and comfort. There's Clara, Helen's mom. And there's what? A cold, alien father who knows nothing at all about his daughter. He's a downer for Helen, if anything, a stranger. "I'm not going with you," Helen said firmly. Pulled away from her parent. "I'm not going to town." The man looked at his daughter, flapping his eyes confusedly. He didn't know what to say to her in response. The neighbors came to the rescue. Very carefully and carefully they conveyed to Helen the idea that there was no other way out. The neighbors hugged the girl and said that they would miss her very much. In the eyes of these people were tears of women and men, grandmothers and grandfathers. They all gave her their phone numbers and assured her that they would always welcome her calls. Helen was crying too, and it was hard to part with Novopetrovskaya. But the sensitive adults managed to convince the girl that she had to do it. There was no other way. "You come to visit," David said. "On vacation with a little picture will live at my place. I don't care if there are 2 girls or 3. You'll have more fun." Helen knew it wasn't a polite invitation. David really sincerely waited for her on vacation, and it made her feel a little warmer and brighter. So Helen went to the city. It was not the first time the girl found herself in her father's apartment. She and her grandmother sometimes came to visit him. Helen even had her own room here, a bed, a large, separate closet, a desk, everything a child needs. Truth be told, the girl never liked this place much better. She loved her bedroom in her grandmother's house. There were many cozy and important things there, plush toys, interesting books, an aquarium with shark fish, but there was no escape. "We'll have to get settled in the new place." The first thing Helen did was to put on the bed, the very teddy bear that David had given her in the summer before the first grade. At once it became cozier. The toy reminded the girl of those happy, carefree times when her grandmother was around. Helen's life was completely upside down. There was a lot to get used to. A new room, a new school, new faces around unfamiliar terrain, other rules. A father constantly immersed in his own thoughts. He'd moved to a new position that didn't involve months of traveling. He had to be near his daughter all the time, and he was indeed constantly present. But only physically. Stephen was clearly far away. Helen, I saw, my father misses the sea, his colleagues, his friends, his old job. And he often complained to acquaintances that he gets much less money now. I'm not used to living like this, counting pennies until payday. The man told one of his former colleagues over the phone. You can't earn as much here on the big land as you can at sea. Stephen tried very hard to be a good father. In the mornings, he made his daughter breakfast. In the evenings, he remembered to ask her how her day was. He listened to her parents half-heartedly. Helen saw perfectly well that he was not at all interested in what she thought of the teacher, and which of her classmates said what to her. Stephen bought the girl everything she needed: clothes, groceries, school supplies, toys. He even enrolled her in music school. You used to play guitar a lot there. Why don't you play it anymore? Helen sighed. Yes, indeed, since her grandmother was gone, she had never played anything, simply because she wasn't in the mood. There was so much going on in her mind and soul. It was like a constant chaos. By the end of the day, the girl was so tired of her own thoughts, impressions, and emotions that she fell asleep like a cat. Was it up to her to play the guitar? But the words of her father made Helen remember her favorite instrument. The girl took the guitar, ran her fingers over the strings, and she immediately felt lighter, as if a warmth from the past began to smell. And why had she never guessed that music would soothe her? Do you want to go to music school? Her father suggested. Helen thought about it and agreed. From early years, she heard from others that she needed to go there, that in their small village, such a talent could not be fully revealed. That Helen needs competent teachers from the city? And here it is, the opportunity that everyone was talking about. It took a lot of effort for the father to get his daughter enrolled. First of all, the school year was coming to an end. Secondly, the school teachers were not satisfied with the age of the student. The girl was 10 years old, and the music school accepted her at the age of 6 or 7. But the father knew how to insist on his own. And so after only a couple of days after their conversation, the girl began to attend a new educational institution. The school was big, bright. It was not at all like their village house of culture, the interiors of which had not changed since the Soviet era. Everything was different here. Helen at first was even afraid of the new teachers. They looked too strict and aloof. But when the study began, the girl realized that she got exactly where she needed so much new knowledge, so many subtleties. Helen absorbed musical literacy like a sponge, and of course, made great strides. Very soon, teachers began to praise the diligent, talented student. It was very pleasant. The girl gradually settled in the city. She had new friends and girlfriends. True, such warm and almost kinship relations as with the guys, no one has not formed. But it was not customary to make friends here at all, as it was great there anyway. Helen and her classmates went to the movies, and to the skating rink, to the pizzeria, and to entertainment centers. Sometimes they just walked around the park, sometimes they gathered at someone's house. The birthdays of local children were not like in the village. They were not hearty gatherings of children and adults, but trips to a bowling alley, trampoline, or a center. The child was entertained by special people dressed in costumes, heroes, cartoons, animators. Interesting, of course, in some places, even fun. But every time Helen remembered her own heartwarming, full of sincere hugs. Birthdays. They were organized for her granddaughter by her loving grandmother. How Helen missed and longed for her. It was not the first great loss in her life. But the girl's mother did not know her, was not used to her, and therefore was not too worried about her absence. Grandmother was a different matter. With her father, the relationship was polite, even, but something strained, clumsy. Even he tried to be involved as a parent. But it didn't work. He wasn't interested in his daughter's thoughts and experiences. He didn't understand her at all. Helen did not feel even a small part of the love and warmth that her grandmother gave her, and it was very hard. The girl literally froze. It was good that there was music in her life. Helen saved herself by picking up a guitar and dissolved its melodic sound. She played what the teachers assigned. She also picked up songs she liked or composed something of her own. With the help of sounds, the girl spilled out her emotions, longing for her grandmother and her former life, anxiety, desire to be closer to her father, the only relative now. Music was relaxing. It calmed me down, helped me feel more confident. Time passed. The life of the small family was gradually getting better. Stephen was surprised to discover that his daughter could cook perfectly well. It was unexpected. The children of his acquaintances of that age could not hold a knife in their hands and were considered almost babies. Helen, on the other hand, was adept with all kitchen tools. And in her younger years, she baked mind-boggling pies and cooked flavorful borscht. When the girl first made her and her father a delicious dinner from the leftovers found in the refrigerator, the man was mesmerized. Returning from work, even at the entrance to the entranceway, he caught the aroma, from which he began to salivate profusely. But it could not have occurred to Stephen that these odors were coming from his apartment. "What's all this about you?" Stephen marveled as he entered the apartment. "Or did someone come to see us?" "It was me," smiled Helen. She liked the look of amazement on her parents' face. "My grandmother taught me." Grandma had indeed taught her granddaughter the art of cooking from a young age. When Helen was still a little girl, she used to help her knead dough. And becoming a little older, the girl learned to wield a knife. As a skilled hostess, she even liked to cook. It's almost like music, a real art. Now Helen often cooked for their little family and did it with great pleasure. She liked to see how eagerly her father devoured her culinary masterpieces. The relationship between the daughter and her father gradually improved. Yes, the adaptation was not easy and very long. It was a lot of work for both of them. But in the end, Helen got what she wanted: warmth and care of her favorite native man. It did not happen at once, not suddenly. Father's heart defended gradually. The icy crust binding him first gave cracks, then slowly fell away, crumbled. One day, Stephen found it interesting to talk to his daughter. She has become quite mature, sensible, and her life is rich, filled with events and impressions. Now the father looked at his daughter very differently. Helen felt it and was glad of the change. Her father was no longer withdrawn. When he came home from work, Stephen now shared with his daughter his plans for the future and news from work. Father and daughter went on several vacations, just like Grandma had asked them to. Stephen showed Helen the big cities. The girl marveled and admired, looking around. And Stephen genuinely enjoyed her reaction. These were such wonderful trips. Helen found out that her father was a very intelligent and erudite man. He was knowledgeable in a wide variety of fields: architecture, history, archaeology, culture, and enjoyed sharing that knowledge with his daughter. The first summer after her grandmother passed away, Helen came to the village with her father. The man prepared the house for the long absence of the owners, closed the window shutters, bought furniture, threw out unnecessary junk from the attic and from the basement. Stephen also found some real treasures: puffy albums with photos that his grandmother had so carefully kept. Here was the entire family history from Grandma and Grandpa's ancestors to Helen. This archive my father took home to the city apartment. Getting the house ready took only a couple days. During this time, Helen felt as if familiar and native places had come back in time. Smiling neighbors, old friends who missed her so much. When her father told the girl it was time to go back, Helen even had tears in her eyes. "How can we go back? We've only been here for a short time. But I have to go to work and I'm done with all my business. Why would we stay?" The father hadn't gotten to know his daughter very well. He couldn't understand the girl's feelings. But David, of course, knew right away. "Let her stay with me." "At least for a couple of weeks," the old man said to Stephen. "My granddaughters are here. They have been friends since birth. The three of them miss each other. They will walk to the river in the woods, run fresh air, breathe. It's a blessing. It's better than girls in a stuffy concrete box all day long. While you're at work, That's weird. Stephen stretched out uncertainly. Are you an idiot, Dim? As if she's nobody. What do you mean, nobody? The old man was indignant. She's like a third granddaughter to me. From now on, I'm not going to finish her. These words of the elderly neighbor echoed warmly in Helen's heart. She begged, still looking at her father to spend at least a few weeks in her favorite village in the company of her best friends. This is happiness, after all. Father agreed. Helen jumped for joy, and Kathy and Maria jumped with her. It was a wonderful time. It was the same as always. Playing with friends, staying out late, familiar places, neighbors who had known you since birth. Except that Grandma wasn't around her house, looked out onto the road, warded up places in them. Sadness periodically squeezed the girl's heart. The surrounding people sensitively caught these changes, Helen's moods, and tried to support her. It was easier for the girl with them. And then the father came for his daughter, and everything was over. Helen cried as she left for the city. Her friends and girlfriends hugged her. David stroked the girl's head, but nothing. Yes, and the dampness lower in the back. You're not going away forever. Here will be your fall vacation. Father will bring you here to rest. We all welcome you here. Helen understood that the elderly neighbor was not just saying that to make a point. She was really always welcome at Petrovka. Realizing this simple truth made it easier and warmer on the soul. But Helen never came to the village for the vacations again. Soon after her departure, David was hospitalized. A stroke. He pulled through then, but he could no longer live alone in the village. David was taken in by his daughter, Maria, and Kathy's mother. The family lived in another town. So Helen never saw her childhood friends or her kind neighbor again. Another blow of fate, another one. Be that as it may, the girl still got used to the new reality. Relations with her father became more cordial and warm. The everyday life got better. Life was not so bad. At least, next to Helen was always a native person, ready to support him and listen. And the girl appreciated it. But the father, he more and more often talked about the fact that he wants to return to the sea. You see, this is my element: waves, wind, sea air, and space. Nothing for miles around. It takes my breath away. Helen understood. She knew exactly what it was like when your heart started to pound joyfully at the sight of your favorite landscapes. And we don't have enough money, Stephen lamented. Those who go on voyages are paid many times more. But here on the ground, the wages are different. Helen did not think they were in need. They had everything they needed, even more. They dressed beautifully, ate well, traveled. But my father still dreamed of more. We often reminisced about his former earnings. Well, I'm an adult now. Helen made a good point once. I'm 13. I've been going to school on my own for a long time. I've been cooking since I was a kid. Why don't you come back? I see how much you miss the sea, don't I? I can manage on my own. No, you're just a child. You can't be left alone for too long. I don't know what could happen. What could happen? Sincerely perplexed the girl. She felt independent enough to live a month or two alone. Yeah, it'll be boring without her daddy, but she'll be fine. The law says you can't be left alone. You're only 13. The neighbors will find out. They'll call child services. Yeah, the neighbors here are weird. Not like in the village, agreed Helen. How do you feel about having a nanny? Nanny Helen. Well, if I go on a voyage, you need someone to look after you. It won't be a babysitter for the kids, but more like a house manager. Your au pair, I don't need no au pair, muttered Helen. But she already realized that her father wouldn't leave her alone anyway, as she shouldn't. All right, hire your own at-home ruler, the girl waved her hand. Father decided to return to the sea, immediately perked up. Now he smiled and joked a lot. Stephen looked a perfectly happy man. Helen was happy to look at her parent, but also worried a little. What if she would not find common ground with this woman? What should look after her and the house? What if it turns out to be some nasty aunt? The search for the house by the ruler did not progress very well. Father contacted many agencies and called the ads himself, but he only came across nannies. For babies, it was pensioners or students, ready for a fee to spend a few hours a day with a small child. But to live together with a teenager and look after the apartment, no one agreed. However, my father did not give up hope of finding such a person. Who is looking, he will always find. Optimistically, he said to his daughter. After another setback, one day Stephen returned from a friend's birthday party in high spirits. It was late in the evening. Helen was sitting on a difficult math homework assignment when her happy parents came up to her and announced that the whole matter was settled. What was settled the girl didn't understand. I found a babysitter for you. I mean, the ruler of the house. That's an option. You can't even think of a better one. Helen was a little tense. After all, it was about her fate. Could you be more specific? The girl asked. And the father told his daughter the story of this fateful, as it would later turn out, encounter. Stephen had come to his buddy's birthday party. They had once graduated from university together, then even worked on the same ship. Later, the paths of old friends parted, but between them remained a warm, friendly relationship. It was Sam's anniversary. On this occasion, the man decided to roll a big celebration in a restaurant. Among the guests were many people whom Stephen saw for the first time. Among them was Adriana, an acquaintance of Sam's wife. The tall, slender woman looked beautifully stylish and tastefully dressed, smiling and friendly. At some point, Adriana and Stephen got to talking. Both of them had already had a few drinks and were relaxed. The evening moved into a phase of revelations. It was time for fascinating and frank life stories. It turned out that Adriana had recently divorced her husband. Or rather, according to the woman, her husband simply put her and her daughter on the street for a stupid quarrel. How could that man do that to his child? Stephen was outraged. I have a daughter myself. Jenna is not his daughter, Adriana sighed. She is my child from my first marriage. My husband, now ex-husband, could never accept another man's daughter. He never loved her. Adriana was in a desperate situation. Money for renting a place to live was woefully inadequate. The woman could not find a good job, as she had no education or experience. Adriana devoted herself to her husband and daughter. She looked after the house, cooked her husband delicious meals, organized the household. And he was a successful businessman, providing the family with money. Adriana felt quite happy and protected, but without realizing it, she was in a very vulnerable position, as she was completely financially dependent on her husband. And now I am alone in such a poor situation, grabbing any part-time job to feed myself and Jenna. My parents have no help for a long time. A friend invited me to a party. She said that I need a little distraction from everything, that I still think about my problems all the time. Yes, and I thought I was in a hopeless situation. Stephen stretched out. It's much harder for you, of course. I hope everything works out for you in the end. I'll try to help you with your work. It's kind of a secretary thing in our world. What happened to you? Adriana let the potential job offer slip past her ears. A desperate situation. And Stephen told this jokingly beautiful woman about everything about the death of his beloved wife during childbirth, about the daughter, about the mother who raised the girl until she was 10 years old, about the difficulties of adapting to her own child. When suddenly Helen was left without the care of a loving grandmother, well, and about her dream, about the sea, of course. I'm also looking for a nanny for my daughter, but no one agrees. People offer hourly babysitting services for kids, but no one wants to live with a teenager and look after the house. Adriana's eyes lit up at the submission from the man. Don't you realize that our meeting today is not an accident? The woman exclaimed. It's just a miracle. The very act of bringing us together. Much later it would turn out that it was not Providence that brought Sterhepov and Adriana together. Jubilee's wife was aware of the situation of her husband's friend, and she really wanted to help her friend, who was in distress. The women purposely arranged for Adriana and Stephen to meet for the holidays. Both thought it was a wonderful outlet for both the woman and the single man. How old is your child? Adriana clarified. 13. And my daughter Jenna is 15. I know how to raise teenage girls. I know how to approach them. I love talking to them. We're gonna make it work. Stephen thought about it. He needed a ruler at home. That was true. But he was counting on a professional employee of a specialized agency. And here was Adriana, and with a daughter. But on the other hand, time was running out. We're about to go on a trip, and the problem's not solved yet. Your little girl is about to go through puberty. It's a very dangerous period. I know we have Jenna, and it's already been passed at this age. Children need special supervision, or else it's not far from trouble. Adriana spoke convincingly and looked confident. Stephen thought about it. Indeed, this woman has a lot of experience with children. She had a daughter a little older than Helen. The girls will be together. I wondered if they would find a common language. In addition, Adriana, real beauty, Stephen liked in her company. She was very disposable. After thinking about it, the man agreed. I think this is a great option, he smiled at Adriana, whom he liked more and more. A strong woman who had withstood many blows of fate without breaking her chassis. That was how she learned benevolence. Pleasant, intelligent, sensitive, right? Exactly the kind of person Stephen would want Helen to be around. Adriana and her daughter Jenna moved into Stephen and Helen's apartment. The man put them in the living room. There was plenty of room. Both Adriana and Jenna seemed nice and kind, special to Helen at first. Wow, how cool is your hair? Jenna marveled, barely seeing the girl. Can I try to braid it for you? Helen shrugged. She'd never really cared much for her hair. She did a neat ponytail before school, and that was it. But Jenna had built on Helen's head a strong braid hairstyle, which incredibly found the girl. Helen admired her reflection in the mirror. Are you a beauty? Jenna smiled. You are, you too, mouthed Helen. Not that was the unadulterated truth. Both Jenna and her mother were real beauties, tall, slender, big eyes. The kind that always attracts attention, the kind that men always look at. And both Jenna and Adriana knew how to emphasize the advantages of appearance. They chose the right outfits, skillfully applied makeup, made beautiful and very stylish hairstyles. Helen at first perceived it all as magic. In her and her father's house, there was never any cosmetics, or filled with clothes, closets. The girl watched Adriana's movements mesmerized as she applied makeup in front of the mirror. Interesting, isn't it? The woman smiled, noticing the look, the girl's going. Sit down next to me. I'll show you how it's done. And in half an hour, Adriana made of a completely different person. In the mirror, the girl saw not herself, but a beautiful girl from Ruzel, whose eyes, a delicate blush on her cheeks and plump, doll-like lips. Magnificently admired. Always walk like that. But Helen couldn't always walk like that. Yes, beautiful, of course. But the feeling of makeup on the girl's face was not liked at all. And it was a shame about the time. First, the night and the makeup, then she washes it off. It could take an hour to do it all. Adriana and Jenna were giving Helen something she'd been missing. A woman's attention. They went shopping together and picked out outfits, gossiped. Discussing movies and stars before school, Helen now always flew Jenna. She did wonderful hairstyles, stylish, beautiful, comfortable. Adriana and Jenna also helped the girl with her closet. Your clothes are kind of teddy bear, cotton and gray. Not happy, Adriana declared. Inspected the girl's closet. At school, they don't allow to wear other things. Helen waved her hands. Somehow she hadn't thought about it at all before. Nonsense. You can always find something that will fit into the regulations and fit nicely. Jenna, I think we should go shopping. Are you coming? You have such great taste. We're gonna need your advice. Of course, I love shopping with you. Adriana and Jenna had indeed picked out things for Helen that made her look like a princess, revealing lace blouses, slightly shorter skirts, high-heeled shoes. Well, that's another thing, Adriana rejoiced. Looking over her ward, you have a wonderful figure. You are slender, long-legged. Why hide it all in a uniform and a hoodie? You should be wearing a sack of potatoes. Helen had never gotten so many compliments at school. For the first time in her life, she felt not smart, but really beautiful. And it was wonderful. Jenna became for Helen a real older friend, almost the sister she had always dreamed of having. She was older. Jenna told the girl about her relationships with boyfriends and girlfriends. It was so exciting that Helen would forget to even breathe. It was like a soap opera, only it was real. Jenna was a wonderful storyteller, and her speech flowed smoothly and measuredly. And Helen's eyes were filled with pictures of this beautiful girl's life. Helen admired Jenna. They were bantering again. Adriana came into their room. "Come on, let's go to our movies and watch the pizza." Those were wonderful days. Helen felt part of the exquisite feminine world. The girl's father adored him, but he couldn't give her all that girlishness. It turned out that Helen needed that companionship. She hadn't even realized it before. When Adriana found out that Helen could cook well, she was absolutely delighted. "Wow," admired the woman, seeing how the girl takes out of the oven tray with pies. "It's you yourself, yes." "Not without pride," answered Helen. "My grandmother taught me. I've been doing it for a long time." Helen was bored with the food she had ordered from the restaurant, so she decided to treat Adriana and Jenna to some homemade pastries. "It's divine," praised Jenna, taking a big bite out of the pie. "I've never tasted anything like it, but it's bad for your figure." "At your age, it's no big deal," Adriana smiled. "But you, Helen, surprise me. You won't believe me. And I still haven't learned to bake. And you're so young, but you're already so good." Helen blossomed with these compliments. Now, to please Adriana and Jenna, the girl tried to cook something. Every day she actually did much better than Adriana. The woman's soups often turned out too runny and salty, and the skates constantly picked up from the top and didn't fit inside. That was why Adriana preferred to order takeout. Helen, on the other hand, had no trouble cooking dinner or lunch for the three of them. The girl did it gladly. Jenna and Adriana. They had taken such good care of her, taught her so much. And then my dad came back. Adriana and Jenna moved back into their rented apartment, and Helen was very upset by this fact. Helen missed now their heart-to-heart talks, trips to cafes and stores. The girl missed Adriana and Jenna, who had shown her a different side of life, one that Helen had not even suspected. Her father, of course, asked his daughter how life was in his absence. Helen described Adriana and Jenna in the most vivid colors. "They're so great. Can't you imagine?" She shared her impressions with her parent. "They're so interesting, so good." The father smiled. The girl could see that he was happy with her stories. A month passed, and Stephen was again sent on a voyage, this time for an even longer period than the first time. Again, Adriana and her daughter came to look after Helen. The time flew by. When did the father return? Adriana and Jenna hadn't gone anywhere. They stayed in the apartment, which Helen was incredibly happy about. The girl noticed, of course, that her father looked at Adriana in a special way. And the woman herself, though she tried to hide it, clearly sympathized with her employer. But Helen thought that it all seemed to her that she was just wishful thinking. Turns out she wasn't. Yes, it had been coming to that for a long time. Jenna looked at Helen like a small child as she shared her impressions of what was happening. There was no doubt it would happen. She was just a little wrong about the timing. "Well, yes, Jenna, she is so attentive." Experienced eye diamond at her father again came in the flight, after which they signed. They didn't have a big wedding, just the four of them at a restaurant. Helen was over the moon at the time. This beautiful, kind woman had joined their family. She's going to live with them now, giving Helen the feminine attention she so desperately needs. That's great. Helen had dreamed of something like this for a long time, but everything turned out much better than she could have imagined. Not only does she have Adriana, but Jenna, practically an older sister, a friend who knows so many interesting things. Everything changed as soon as father left on his voyage. The stamp in the passport dramatically transformed Adriana's relationship with her stepdaughter. Helen expected from her stepmother and half-sister the same behavior, care, heart-to-heart talks, joint walks. But all this stopped abruptly. Adriana went to friends and beauty parlors. Jenna also lived her own life. Friends, admirers, nightclubs. And Helen, she was all alone, alone again. She was abruptly no longer paid attention to. The only thing the girls were praised for was cooking and cleaning. Helen single-handedly cleaned the entire apartment and cooked mind-blowing lunches and dinners just to earn Adriana's approval. She didn't realize what was going on. Her stepmother praised her discreetly and ordered new dishes for the next day. Sometimes Adriana also asked Helen to mop the floors. That was all the communication. Helen felt confused and cheated. "Jenna, Tell me, how did you guys hang out at the club? Addressed one day by a girl with a question to Jenna. Jenna absent-mindedly looked at Helen and answered nothing. When the girl repeated her question, Jenna sighed heavily and muttered, "What kind of bailiff are you? You're just a sticky little thing. You're impossible to be around." It was a blow to Helen. She thought she and Jenna were friends. The girl used to share details of her life with her. They talked a lot, went out together. Jenna gave Lena invaluable advice on makeup and the combination of clothing items. And now it's like this. More to come. Adriana had gotten into the swing of things. Helen was now in charge of the entire household. The stepmother did very little cooking in her husband's absence. It was the stepdaughter's responsibility. Cleaning was the same. If earlier the girl was at least praised for her help at home, now she received only remarks and reproaches if she did not have time to do something. And it was hard. Helen also had to study and go to music school. Of course, the girl's grades deteriorated. It is impossible to do all the housework and study well at the same time. Helen tried to explain to Adriana that she couldn't cope. "I'm tired and I don't have time to study. Music has been skipped for the last time. Let Jenna cook and clean at least sometimes. That, my dear, is called laziness." Adriana looks around her face with an indifferent look. "Nothing supernatural is required of you. Didn't you know that people who live together and household chores are shared equally? Evenly. That was a little out of line. There was no such thing as equal sharing." Jenna lived her life to the fullest, going out with friends, going on dates, shopping, and going to beauty salons. Sometimes the underage Jenna, even at night at home, and did not show up. Adriana would make phone calls. She periodically even drove somewhere at night to pick up a daughter. Only the father, he knew nothing about this side of Svetlana's life. Under him, the girl behaved impeccably. Jenna did absolutely nothing around the house. Even the bed for her had to be made by Helen. Jenna was preparing for final exams. Adriana declared in response to Helen's fair remark. At first, the girl was still trying to defend herself. "You have only 2 more years to go, and she's already here." But Helen never saw Jenna with a textbook in her hands. The girl attended school reluctantly. She had a big problem with her studies. All she had on her mind was dating and partying, and she only cared about her own appearance. Jenna did not get out of the beautician from beauty salons. This, of course, gave its fruits. The girl looked just beautifully groomed, spectacular, stylish. Adriana's father spent the lion's share of the money left for the household on himself and his daughter. Helen, however, was left over on a residual principle. Adriana was only in the kitchen when her father was home. She created the image of the perfect housewife. The woman didn't work. She explained to her husband that the girls needed special care now, because they were at a difficult age and all that. An eye on the teenagers. During this period, Stephen agreed with Adriana's arguments. She was generally good at convincing others that her decisions were reasonable and beneficial to everyone. It was her talent. Stephen even sincerely believed that he himself offered his wife to take care of the house and children, and appreciated this, as he thought, Adriana's sacrifice. To put her career on the altar of happiness and well-being of the family, it's practically a feat. Adriana had a great influence on her father. He looked at her admiring eyes and believed every word of his wife, considered her perfect and infallible. Helen used to like this. She was happy for her own man. So many years alone. And now, at last, had found his love. But now the girl was hurt and even scared. Adriana was gradually turning from a kind and sensitive woman into a monster. Stepmother made ever higher demands on the colony. The girl was bombarded with reproaches every day. She cooks wrong. And she cleans too slowly and pays too much attention to nonsense. What do you want on that fool of yours? Adriana scornfully pointed her finger, decorated with impeccable manicure on the guitar. I already have a headache from your tedious songs. Helen was silent. She knew that if she opened her mouth and tried to defend herself, she would be bombarded with a torrent of insults. It was already past the point. It was better to keep silent. It would calm her stepmother down faster. And they didn't like Helen's passion for music. She repeatedly called the girl untalented. constantly asking her to play quietly, as if it was possible, forced stepdaughter to skip lessons at music school. Only music, it was a real salvation for the girl. Playing calmed her down, relaxed her, gave her joy. After all, joy and already became too little in Helen's life. With her father, Adriana, of course, behaved very differently. Helen couldn't get used to it. Metamorphosis. A sensitive, anxious parent, a wonderful hostess, a loving wife. Her father often said how lucky he was to have met such a woman. Adriana slowly turned the man against his daughter. Carefully, delicately, masterfully, the woman disguised herself. She was presenting in front of Stephen, an exciting parent. Helen was going through puberty. She's become so snappy, lazy, hates everyone around her. She dropped out of school. She's not into it. All she can think about is going out and sneaking out of the house. That's what Adriana told her father. Not really caring that Helen didn't hear her conversation. The woman didn't care. The man wouldn't believe his daughter's words if she tried to justify herself. Adriana's influence was too strong. Too skillfully did the woman manipulate those around her. What was to be done? Puzzled, Stephen looked at his spouse. He was waiting for advice and help and support. Of course, the man loved his daughter and did not want her to slip into the abyss. Yes, Adriana used such figurative, vivid expressions to convince him. I think she should leave music school, the stepmother had once suggested. Helen spends too much time on nonsense and her studies suffer. I generally feel that under the label of music school, she is walking around in bad company. I talked to the music teacher. There's a lot of truancy there. Father, as usual, agreed with his wife. Her words were always decisive. When the man announced to his daughter that she would no longer study music, Helen immediately realized whose handiwork it was. It was the first time the girl openly objected. She defended her life's work and therefore suddenly became brave and determined. No, I don't want to quit music school. Adriana, she just wants me to spend more time at home and do all the housework. I cook, I clean, I do the laundry. I'm like a servant while you're away, you see. Adriana looked at her spouse and looked frustrated and worried while doing so. You see how she reacts. And all I was doing was teaching the child to work. It's no big deal. In all normal families, children have some small responsibilities. But Helen just wants to be out and about. That's dangerous at that age. Look at your daughter. Helen couldn't take it. Watch her. The girl couldn't take it. She snapped. It played right into their hands. She pretended to be an understanding woman who was not offended by the teenager's temper, but merely concerned about him, wishing him well. Helen had tried to complain to her father about Adriana before, but he hadn't taken her words seriously. What about his new wife? She's so perfect. You're just jealous. Stephen stroked his daughter's head. I'll try to pay more attention to you. Whatever Helen said, it didn't sound convincing. After all, her father was constantly being manipulated. Adriana is a skilled manipulator. And after this open argument, Helen's words had ceased to have any meaning for Stephen. At least the girl thought so. By the way, Helen still had to leave the music school. Her father insisted. The girl lost her only outlet. She did, of course, occasionally play for herself. It somehow relieved the stress Helen was now under all the time. From time to time, Adriana pitted father and daughter against each other to consolidate the effect. She played people like chess pieces. The father was at the mercy of his bewitching wife. He was in full confidence that Berta made a monster out of his sweet daughter and thanked fate that in this difficult period next to the girl is an experienced and attentive woman. At first, Helen still tried to get through to the parent. But every time after that, Adriana organized something new. Once Jenna took money from the family stash. Helen knew it. The girl had heard Jenna begging her mother for money for a trip with friends. She had refused her daughter, explaining that she didn't like the girl's company at all. But Jenna was not used to restrictions. She still went away, which made Adriana furious. She reprimanded her daughter on the phone, threatened her, and ordered her to return immediately. Of course, Jenna didn't think of obeying, not the kind of person she was. Of course, both Adriana and Helen understood where the girl took the money and Stephen's stash. But when the father returned, The stepmother blamed Helen for everything. Jenna was already home at the time and was portraying herself as a model high school student with acting ability. She took after her mother and perhaps even surpassed her. The father did not scold the daughter then? No. He had a long talk with her, trying to find out why the girl needed such a sum of money. Maybe she was in trouble. Maybe you need help. Helen tried to explain to her parent how things really were. He squeezed even harder as severe pains and begged her not to deceive him. "Tell the truth," asked the father, taking his daughter's hands. "What is going on with you?" Helen did not say anything more. It was useless. Her father thinks she is a troubled teenager capable of stealing. What can I say? Adriana's words proved to be a powerful tool. The man doesn't trust his daughter, but he takes his wife's every word at face value, and there was nothing the girl could do about it. Time passed. The moment of Svetlana's enrollment in the university was approaching. Helen realized that the girl would fail miserably. I wonder how her stepmother would explain it to her father. She had been working hard on her daughter's image all these years. Jenna appeared in her stories as a smart girl, a diligent student, a gifted girl. Adriana constantly compared the girls, and Jenna invariably resembled Helen in everything. But that's okay, Adriana urged her spouse. I raised one girl to be such a success. I can do the same with your daughter. I know how to raise girls at a certain age they need a firm hand. The father agreed with Adriana and with a light heart, gave her all the rights to raise Helen. You know best, don't you? He replied to his wife. Helen, she's kind of gotten used to that kind of life. Recriminations, ridicule, indifference, shifting on the shoulders of the teenager most of the household duties, limitation in everything. Helen sometimes felt like Cinderella. Adriana was the textbook stepmother. They say a fairy tale is a lie. It's a hint. And then, in her father's absence, Adriana was visited by William, a young man, stylishly dressed, always smiling and polite. The woman explained to the girls that he was a distant relative. But William looked at Adriana with such eyes that Helen realized her stepmother was lying. Jenna didn't believe her mother either. She smirked every time this guest appeared in the house. Now Adriana could afford not to come home at night. And Helen knew exactly what was going on. Already her stepmother had a lover, this very William. Young, handsome, charming, in love. The girl felt bad for her father. He trusts his wife so much. And the girl also tried to understand why Adriana needed this man. After all, stepmother did not do anything for nothing. If she approached a man, it was only to get something from him. And William didn't appear in Adriana's life by accident. Maybe it was just a matter of feeling. A man, he's handsome, reminiscent of model boys in magazines. Even Svetka is giving him a special look. Helen, trying to tell your father what's going on. Careful. She also told him about the man who sometimes comes to their house and has become the norm from Adriana. Father frowns. You are telling the truth and trying to smear Adriana again. Are you always fighting? Dad, it's the truth. Almost screamed the girl. She felt that her father did not believe her completely, but still a grain of doubt, she and his soul wounded. Of course, Stephen talked to his wife. She told him about the relatives who had come from out of town for a while, and then began to complain again about Helen, who was lying and arguing with everyone just out of a desire to protest. Helen heard every word her stepmother said. The girl clenched her fists in impotent anger. Adriana looked and sounded as always, quite convincing. Not like she herself was a resentful adult girl with problematic behavior. Stephen didn't know what to do. Leave his dream job again and go back to the big land. But it's going to be even harder to do that now. All the same, he supports not only himself and his daughter, but also 2 people took on the responsibility, so he must adequately provide for the family. Helen completely out of control. I guess she needs her father around. But how to leave the ship? Earn very little now, not an option. Adriana charming, delightful, intelligent, subtle. Stephen lost his head for this woman at first sight. They met just in time for a mutual friend's anniversary. And then it turned out that Adriana and Stephen could help each other. It was like a jigsaw puzzle. At first, Helen was delighted with her stepsister's stepmother. Her daughter's eyes lit up with a happy fire. She was so excited to have Adriana and Jenna move in with them. Then, as they left for their voyage, Stephen was calm. His daughter was in good hands. Coming home was much more pleasant too. How happy is it to have a woman you love waiting impatiently for you? And such a beautiful woman. Stephen had forgotten it could be like that. The man invited himself. And then Helen went through that notorious age of transition. The child was like a substitute. The girl was now lazy and snapping, lying and skipping school. She tried to argue with her stepmother and father. She was making up stories about Kathy and Jenna, reacted inappropriately to ordinary requests, and once even took a decent sum from the family piggy bank. I wonder what that kind of money was for. Stephen was afraid that his daughter had fallen in with bad company, especially since Adriana thought so too. Helen was always complaining about her stepmother. No wonder. That's how her stepdaughter was raised, restricted her freedom and the horror of having to clean up after herself, much nicer. Lazy all day long, not bothering with lessons and household chores. To live at one's own pleasure. Of course, Adriana was now in the girl's way, so she was pissed off. Stephen understood this, but did not know how to help his daughter through this difficult age with the least possible loss. He never understood Helen at all. It's a pity that in the maternity hospital together with the child is not given a manual for its operation. Now Helen had overstepped the mark. She hinted that Adriana had a lover, William. Her spouse did not lean. Indeed, her relative, who had recently moved to their town, a busy young man who had never found time to get to know Stephen, was visiting them. Working hard, trying to make her way in this life. But Helen, she assures her that Adriana is a lying monster and that William and her lover. Stephen stares into his daughter's honest eyes and is horrified. Had Helen really become a deceiver? It was so unlike her. That's when the man decided to install a hidden surveillance camera in the apartment. He's going to record it. The clips will be streamed online to his phone. On his next visit, he'll provide Helen with proof. She'll see the footage. She'll realize how stupid and ugly her attempts to smear her look. Adriana might throw something else at her head, and the girl will come to her senses. Nothing like a sobering look at yourself from the outside. Stephen didn't expect to see this at all. At first, he was still feeling guilty, peeking at the homies. It's like he doesn't trust them. He's good, I'll give you that. But record it. The footage the camera broadcast turned his mind upside down. Adriana really did treat Helen like a servant. She looked at her with contempt. She made the girl work for the whole family. And these were impossible chores for a teenager. Helen didn't just clean up after herself and run errands. She maintained cleanliness in the whole house, drives plumbing, cooked lunches and dinners. And all she got for it was reproaches and insults. No, when Stephen was home, Adriana didn't act like that. The man couldn't believe his eyes. It made his heart bleed. When Helen appeared to him as a disenfranchised Cinderella, so Adriana really was lying to him all the time, with those honest and loyal eyes. Helen, no matter how many times she tried to get through to her father, he wouldn't believe a word her daughter said. How awful. Poor girl. If he could. A man would now travel hundreds of kilometers and protect his daughter. Oh my. With his own hands, he made his own child's life a nightmare. And yet the girl came to him for help. But Stephen didn't believe her. Her daughter's words sounded like pathetic excuses. Helen's stories about William were also confirmed. Indeed, a young man sometimes came to their house, and he hugged Adriana in a very unrelated way. Sparks were flying between Adriana and William. The camera was quality. Stephen heard every word the couple said. William turned out to be an experienced and not cheap lawyer. Adriana did not have enough money for his services, so she went the usual way, using her strongest charms. Yes, Adriana and William were lovers. The young lawyer must have been influenced by the woman's natural magnetism, and she was certainly pursuing her own agenda. Stephen soon realized what it was: a plot of land in the village. Stephen's mother had left the house and garden as an inheritance to her granddaughter. Adriana knew this and was looking for a way to sell the property. She needed the money. Jenna, women's native daughter, would not have entered the university on a budget. The girl never asserted herself by studying. Miracles, as we know, do not happen. Therefore, Adriana needed a decent amount of money, which would be enough to pay tuition for Jenna. The woman knew very well that Stephen, no matter how much he was in love with her, would never agree to such a thing. That was why she needed William. As the guardian of Helen and Adriana, had the right to dispose of her stepdaughter's property until she came of age. The woman was going to pull off a scheme, sell the house on Petrotha, and the proceeds of the money to pay for Svetlana's education. But Stephen was not to find out about it. William, as an experienced lawyer, he helped his mistress in this case. Adriana, as no one knew how to manipulate people. Realizing what was happening, Stephen clenched his fists in impotent anger. Leonia cannot be left next to these terrible people. One thing before the end of the flight is still a lot of time. It is difficult to interrupt the business trip, but Stephen will do it. Helen is in danger. Helen struggled to hold back her tears. Not enough for Jenna to see how hard it is for her. She and her mother are deliberately driving her to breakdowns. The girl had made ugly scenes in front of her father more than once because she couldn't hold it in any longer. That played into the stepmother's hands. Now, Adriana has accused Helen of vagrancy. The stepmother is diligently creating an image in her father's eyes of a daughter who is a maverick, rude, and lazy. Now here's more. Helen only had a sleepover at a friend's house. She warned Adriana about it on the phone. Do whatever you want. The stepmother said indifferently into the phone, I don't care. Of course she didn't care. The day before, Helen had given the whole apartment away and cooked for a couple days. Otherwise, the stepmother wouldn't let her out of the house. Returning home the next morning, Helen found police officers in the apartment. At first, the girl thought it was Jenna. She often disappeared at night. Adriana periodically went to get her daughter out of trouble. The policeman asked Adriana if she had found the missing person. She nodded her head, and then the girl realized what was wrong. The stepmother had reported to the police that her underage stepdaughter had not come home for the night, even though she knew exactly where she was. I warned you that I would stay at my friend's house. Helen stretched out his stepmother in amazement. The girl had already guessed that the woman had thought of a new way to make her stepdaughter look like a troubled teenager. This time involving the police. Are you cheating again? The woman exclaimed. What am I going to do with you? One more trick like that, and we'll put her on the register, the official warned as he left the apartment. A record. Maybe that's what the stepmother wanted. And now Helen was trying not to cry from the hook on her bed. The girl hugged the bear, given to her once, and realized that she would be made out in front of her father as a missing girl again. And he, as always, will unconditionally believe his wife will look at his daughter with sad, anxious eyes. That look of pain and disappointment. And it's hard to bear. Suddenly a key turned in the door. Helen was startled. Who could it be? Jenna and Adriana. At home, her father would be at sea for another 3 weeks. Had Adriana really given the key to this William of hers? That was all that was missing. But father's voice came from the hallway. I'm home. You're back so soon. Adriana's voice sounded confused and lusciously happy at the same time. What happiness! I know everything. Father clearly did not share his wife's enthusiasm. I've seen and heard everything. Pack your things. You have until tonight. You won't do anything else. Nothing to my daughter. Helen's heart hammered like a caged bird. She rushed into the hallway and hung around her father's neck as he found out everything. That Helen would find out later. Right now, it didn't even matter. Stephen held his daughter in a tight embrace. He smelled of the sea. Everything will be all right now. Sentenced the man. I'm sorry for not believing you. I won't let anyone hurt you again.